Hello everyone, I'm the DreamTeller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first time I heard it. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was alone in the basement, shifting boxes from one side of the room to the other. It happened so fast that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But I didn't imagine it. The voice said my name, soft at first, but drawn out like a low hiss. It came from the far corner, the spot where the old stone walls meet in a small wedge of darkness that the single overhead bulb can't reach. I tried not to react. I felt my spine stiffen and I forced myself to keep moving the boxes. My mouth went dry and I swallowed hard. No one else was around. There was no reason for me to be afraid, but that voice felt wrong. It felt like something that shouldn't be there. I moved in here shortly after getting married. The house is from the 19th century, with tall windows and creaking floors. It stands on a patch of land set away from the nearest town. Most mornings I see thick fog covering the front yard and swirling around the uneven fence posts. The place feels distant from everything else. It's quiet, but not peaceful. The silence here is heavier than anything I've experienced before. There's always the sensation of being watched even when I'm alone. The basement is made of cold stone. The steps leading down are narrow and worn. The walls sweat with moisture, and a single light bulb hangs from a bare wire. It looks like it was installed decades ago and never updated. There are old shelves along the back wall, filled with rusted tools and jars of nails. A couple of old chairs are piled in one corner. The rest of the basement is just open space, big enough to store a lot of boxes. When I first saw it, I figured it would be a perfect spot to keep holiday decorations or random junk. That changed after I started noticing the strange things that happened down there. It wasn't just the voice. It was the way certain boxes seemed to shift positions overnight. I'm talking about boxes I stacked carefully against the wall. Then, when I came down in the morning, they'd be in a different place. Sometimes they'd be sitting in a circle on the floor. Other times they'd be turned on their side, lined up in a pattern. I looked for footprints or scuff marks, but I never found anything that made sense. Nothing about it felt like normal shifting or settling. It was too deliberate. At first I thought it might be a prank, but nobody else has a key and we're too far from other houses. Besides, the basement door is a heavy wooden door with a big old lock. It looks original to the house with iron hinges. I tried using a new padlock to keep it shut at night. I'd click the lock into place, check it twice, and go to bed. The next morning I'd come downstairs, and the door would be standing wide open. The lock would be on the floor, still closed and intact. There were no scratches on the wood, no sign of forced entry. It was just open, like someone had passed through without bothering to close it behind them. My stomach would clench each time I saw that open door. My heartbeat would pick up, and I'd feel my shoulders tense. It didn't make any sense. I started losing sleep. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the basement. I tried to reassure myself that maybe I did something wrong when I locked it. But I knew I had double-checked it. Then I started hearing the voice more often. It wasn't just on random afternoons. It became more frequent, especially at night if I went down there. The sound always came from the same corner. I'd shine a flashlight in that direction, and I'd see nothing but damp stone walls. Sometimes the voice didn't even sound human. It was hushed, scratchy, and it dragged the syllables of my name in a way that made my skin crawl. My mouth would go dry and I could feel my pulse in my temples. I told myself to ignore it. I told myself it was just some weird echo of the wind through a crack in the foundation. But I knew that was a lie. I could hear the difference between wind and that voice. Wind doesn't call your name. One night I tried to record it on my phone. I walked down with my flashlight and phone in hand. I pressed record and asked, "What do you want?" My voice shook a little. I heard the echo of my own words on the rough walls. Then I heard the voice calling my name, drawn out in that low tone. I caught it on the recording, but the sound was garbled. It was an odd distortion that I couldn't explain. When I played it back, I got chills. There was no other way to describe it. Hearing it through my phone felt even more unreal, but at least it proved it wasn't just in my head. After that, I started noticing other strange things. Sometimes I'd find objects arranged in weird symbols on the basement floor. One morning, I found 3 metal pipe fittings placed in a triangular shape. Another time, I discovered a circle of old screws surrounding a single heavy chain link, like a bizarre little altar. I didn't recognize these shapes from anything I'd seen before. They just looked strange and unsettling. I'd sweep them aside, telling myself it was random junk that fell off a shelf. But I knew it wasn't random. I hadn't placed them there, and they were too neat, too deliberate. My nerves were shot. I was jumpy, constantly on edge. If I heard any creak in the house, my heart would pound. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, so I tried to avoid going down there. I'd only go when absolutely necessary, but that didn't help. The voice seemed to grow louder in my head, almost like it was calling me from below. Sometimes I'd hear it at the top of the basement stairs, whispering my name through the crack under the door. I'd stand there in the hallway, gripping the doorknob, my palms sweaty and my fingers trembling. Eventually, I decided to confront it head-on. I stayed up late one night and marched down there with a strong flashlight, determined to figure out if there was an actual person hiding somewhere. I checked every corner, every shelf. I moved aside stacks of boxes and old furniture. I opened the narrow storage space under the stairs and peeked inside. Nothing. I was alone. The room was cold, and the light from my flashlight cast sharp shadows on the walls. My breath sounded too loud. I swung the beam around one more time before heading back upstairs. As I climbed the steps, I heard that voice again behind me. It said my name louder than ever. It sounded angry, almost insistent. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the flashlight. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and then stared at the doorknob for a long time. The voice stopped, but I was left with a feeling of dread that wouldn't leave me. Over the next few days, I tried my best to ignore everything. I thought if I refused to give it attention, maybe it would vanish. But it got worse. The voice started calling me by name at all hours, even when I wasn't in the basement. Sometimes I'd be in the kitchen or the living room and I'd hear it faintly. I'd freeze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt watched in every corner of the house. I started noticing a pattern in the arrangement of objects. They weren't just random symbols. Each arrangement looked connected to the previous one, like a progression of shapes, circles, triangles, odd loops that looped back on themselves. I had no idea what they meant, but I felt an urge to decipher them. That made no sense, but it nagged at me day and night. I also noticed changes in the air of the basement. The temperature seemed to drop more than usual. My breath formed small clouds in front of my face, even though it wasn't that cold outside. The walls seemed wetter. Water trickled down the stones in thin streams, and the floor felt slick. The smell grew stronger, a mix of damp earth and something like old metal. I tried to keep the door locked, but it didn't matter. Every morning, I found it open. At times, I'd catch the faint sound of something scraping against the stone floor like a box being dragged. I'd rush down, flashlight in hand, only to find everything still. One afternoon, I worked up the courage to examine the darkest corner more closely. I positioned my flashlight there, but the beam felt weak, like the darkness in that corner was swallowing the light. I leaned forward, careful not to slip on the damp floor. My heart thudded in my chest. The closer I got, the harder it was to breathe. I reached out with my hand, thinking I might feel a crack in the wall or maybe a hidden gap, but I just felt cold stone. Then the voice spoke right into my ear. I jerked back, almost falling on the floor. I yelled and scrambled away. I can't even repeat what it said because it wasn't just my name. It was more than that. Words I couldn't understand, repeated in a low rumble. After that, I stayed away from the basement entirely. I blocked the door with a heavy chair. I pushed a small cabinet against it for good measure. At night, I lay awake, listening. The house settled and creaked. The wind rattled the windows, and sometimes I heard a soft whisper drifting through the vents. I tried to keep my breathing steady, My mouth would go dry and I'd feel sweat on my forehead. A few days later, I realized it didn't matter if I went down there or not. The strange patterns of movement kept happening. One morning I found the basement door open again, the chair and cabinet shoved aside. I went down, shining my flashlight at the floor. There were new symbols formed by nails and old hinges. They curved in a spiral, and in the center, there was a small wooden box, the kind that might hold screws or washers. I picked it up. Inside I saw a single key. It looked old with rust around the edges. It was lighter than I expected. I had no idea what it was for, but I felt an overwhelming urge to keep it. My hands were shaking and I felt dizzy. I held on to that key and took it back upstairs. Once I set it on the kitchen table, I spent an hour just staring at it. I wanted to throw it away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. That night I had a dream about the basement. In the dream, I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by boxes arranged in a perfect circle. The walls dripped water. The overhead bulb flickered. Then, out of the darkness, I heard the voice chanting something. It sounded rhythmic, like a repeated phrase. My name slipped in between those unknown words, pulling me deeper. I woke up soaked in sweat, my heart racing. I tried to steady my breathing, but I felt a pressure on my chest like something was trying to crush me. After a few moments, I managed to sit up and flick on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. But the feeling of being trapped didn't go away. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in the basement door itself. The wood looked more warped, and the hinges looked newer, as if someone had replaced them overnight. But I never found any evidence of that. I ran my hand over the metal, expecting to feel fresh scratches or tool marks, but it felt smooth. I started to suspect the house itself was shifting, the old and the new overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. The voice kept coming, day and night. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a faint whisper, so soft I could almost convince myself it was my imagination. Other times, it was clear as day, calling me closer. I tried to leave the house for a few days just to clear my head. But the weather got worse. Thick fog blanketed the roads, and the local radio station advised against driving at night. So I stayed, and the tension built. I felt like the voice was trying to push me to do something. I got glimpses of that old key in my mind, along with those patterns on the basement floor. It felt like a puzzle, but I didn't want to solve it. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. Every time I passed by the basement door, I felt a tightness in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I could swear I heard my name, just on the other side. One evening, I mustered enough courage to crack open the door and shine a flashlight down. The air smelled stale, like old stone and rust. I heard a faint scraping sound. Something moved in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't look like a person. It was just darkness shifting slightly. My hands shook and I slammed the door shut. I slid the deadbolt into place. Then I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. But I felt it there, right on the other side. I backed away, breathing hard. That night I heard pounding on the basement door around 3 a.m. It wasn't heavy or frantic, more like a steady knock. I lay in bed, staring at the dark. My heart hammered. I couldn't bring myself to go check it out. The knocking stopped after a minute or so. Then I heard the sound of something dragging across the basement floor, like a heavy box. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I found the door open again, the lock resting on the floor. The basement light was on, even though I know I had turned it off. I walked down, every step sending shivers through my legs. My stomach churned, and my mouth felt dry. The basement was rearranged in a half circle of crates, and in the corner there was a small table that I didn't remember being there before. I stepped closer. The table held a piece of old parchment covered with strange markings. My flashlight flickered. I thought I heard a faint hiss behind me. I spun around, shining the light on the stone walls. Nothing was there. But the voice spoke again, telling me to pick up the paper. I grabbed it, my hands trembling. The symbols looked like a set of instructions. I couldn't read them, but I felt like I understood them anyway. They felt like directions for some kind of ritual. My heart pounded. I shoved the paper into my pocket and ran upstairs. Now every time I try to ignore it, the voice grows louder. It invades my thoughts when I'm trying to eat, trying to sleep, even when I'm just looking out the window at the fog. My head feels heavy and my nerves are shot. I'm afraid of what will happen if I give in, but it's getting harder to resist. It feels like the house won't let me rest until I do something with that parchment and the key. My name keeps echoing through the halls, through the vents, through the cracks in the floorboards. I can't block it out anymore. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The basement is always there, waiting for me. The door never stays locked. Objects keep shifting, forming new patterns. The symbols on the parchment seem to match what I see on the floor. The voice hovers in my mind, urging me to follow the instructions. I feel it drawing me in, step by step. My body feels weak and my hands won't stop shaking. The thought of performing any kind of ritual terrifies me, but ignoring it doesn't help. The deeper I bury the fear, the louder the voice becomes, and the more intense the activities in the basement grow. I feel like I'm trapped in a loop with no way out. At this moment, I'm sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that old key and the parchment. My breath comes in shallow bursts. My chest feels tight and my palms are clammy. The silence in the house is overwhelming, except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But beneath that hum, I can sense the faint whisper of my name, beckoning me downstairs. I can picture the dark corner and the cold stone walls. It's waiting for me. I can feel it. My mind is torn between the need to understand and the urge to run. I don't know what I'll do next. All I know is that the basement door will not stay shut. The voice will not be silent. The arrangements on the floor will continue, and every night that darkness in the corner seems to expand. It's forcing me toward some unknown purpose. I can't pretend this isn't happening. I can't explain it. But it's real, and it's here. I can hear it right now, calling my name in a low, broken tone. My heart is pounding. My hands are shaking as I write this. There's no one else in this house, and there's no one around for miles. It's just me, the basement, and that voice. And it wants something from me. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I woke up 4 nights ago with my heart hammering and sweat running down my face. I didn't recognize the room at first. It took me a few seconds to remember I was in this old house I rented a few months ago. I had moved here to focus on my painting. My insomnia had gotten worse, and my anxiety made it hard to sleep for more than a few hours at a time. That night, I felt a chill on my arms, even though I kept the windows closed. I glanced at the digital clock by my bed. 3:14 a.m. My eyes were dry and my legs ached. I felt this urge to check the house, almost like I had heard footsteps. I listened carefully, but it was silent. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, stood there by the sink for a minute, and stared at my own reflection in the window. Then I walked to my atelier on the east side of the house. The atelier used to be a large sitting room. It has high ceilings with big windows that let in the pale light from the moon or the early dawn. The light at that hour looked pale and cold, and it made everything look washed out. My easel stood near the windows, surrounded by older paintings. I had left my paints open, and the air smelled of turpentine and old varnish. I felt a little dizzy, so I leaned against the table. The walls creaked, and I felt like the whole house breathed around me. I shook my head and tried to calm down. I noticed that one of the doors near the back of the atelier was slightly open. I thought I had closed it earlier. I walked over and saw the narrow steps leading down to the basement. The basement is bigger than I expected when I first moved in, with stacked crates, dusty furniture, and random items from the previous owner. I stepped down carefully, holding a small flashlight. The air smelled stale. My footsteps sounded too loud against the stone floor. I felt a strange tension in my chest. I scanned the basement shelves for no real reason. I just wanted to make sure everything was in its place. I saw old glass jars, some broken frames, and a few scattered brushes. My beam of light landed on a large canvas leaning against the far wall. It was half covered by a thick cloth. I hadn't noticed it before. My curiosity made me walk over and lift the cloth. I coughed when a cloud of dust hit my face. Then I saw the portrait. It showed a man from the chest up. His hair was dark, with a few streaks of gray near the temples. The brushstrokes around his eyes looked incomplete, like someone had stopped painting before adding the final details. His eyes were unsettling. They had an intense stare, even though the painting was obviously unfinished. The background was a murky gray, and the man's suit was just a rough outline in dark paint. I couldn't tell who he was supposed to be. He didn't look like a famous figure I recognized. The entire canvas had this uneasy energy. I stood there for a while, forgetting my original plan to go back upstairs. I felt drawn to the painting. I noticed small details, the tension around the man's mouth, the shape of his collar, the loose brushwork on his shoulders. Something about the eyes made me uncomfortable. It was like they were watching me, even though they were missing some highlights and details that bring portraits to life. The corners of his mouth looked slightly tense, like he was about to say something. My skin prickled. I decided to carry the portrait upstairs. I wanted to inspect it properly in the atelier, maybe see if I could fix it or finish it. The canvas was heavier than I expected. I felt my back strain as I dragged it up the steps, almost stumbling near the top. I reached the atelier and leaned it against a wall near my main easel. I flicked on the overhead light to get a good look. Dust motes floated in the air. The painting looked darker under the artificial light. The man's face seemed almost grim. I set it against a better backdrop and stepped back. My eyes felt sore, and my hands shook a bit from the effort of hauling it upstairs. I noticed a faint odor coming from the painting. It smelled like old oils, mold, and something else I couldn't identify. My head started to pound. I rubbed my forehead, then started to gather some brushes, linseed oil, and a fresh palette. I wanted to see if the paint was workable. I touched the surface and felt the texture of the dried paint. Parts of it were stiff, but some areas seemed slightly tacky. I think I worked on it until sunrise. I don't remember the exact moment I started painting, but I recall focusing on the eyes first. I always pay special attention to the eyes in my portraits. I thought I could add a few highlights, some definition to the irises, maybe fix the shading around the lids. As I applied the first stroke, I heard a soft sound behind me like a whisper. I turned quickly. Nobody was there. I felt a burst of adrenaline in my chest. The hair on my arms stood up, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I shook off the feeling and turned back to the painting. I added more paint to my brush and leaned in close. The smell got stronger. It felt like chemicals and decay mixed together. My stomach churned and I swallowed hard. As I worked on the left eye, I noticed the edges of the pupil seemed to shift. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was just paint. I told myself I was tired. My insomnia makes me see things sometimes, especially when I'm working in low light. I resumed painting. Around 6 in the morning, the sky brightened outside. I felt the cold air on my neck. My eyes burned and my wrists ached. I stepped back to see my progress. The changes were subtle, but I thought I had captured a sharper intensity in the man's gaze. Something looked off, though. His expression seemed darker than before, like he was glaring at me. I hadn't painted a glare. I had only added highlights. Yet the face on the canvas looked angry. The corners of the mouth were a bit lower and the eyebrows looked heavier. I tried telling myself I had accidentally altered the features. I went to the kitchen, made some coffee, and drank it fast. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing over my shoulder as if I expected someone to appear. The house felt colder than usual. I turned up the thermostat, but the air still felt damp. I returned to the atelier and forced myself to continue. I thought that if I finished the painting, I might lift this strange mood in the room. I mixed more paint and began working on the hair and the suit. The more I painted, the heavier my chest felt. My breathing got shallow. I felt lightheaded. I heard this faint hum in my ears like a faraway voice. I wiped sweat off my forehead. At around 8, I realized I needed sleep. My eyes threatened to close on their own. I set the brush down and turned the portrait to face the wall. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I went to my bedroom and lay on the bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes. I replayed the moment when I thought the pupil shifted. My anxiety spiked and I got up, paced the room and checked my phone. No messages. I forced myself to lie down again, and eventually I dozed off. I woke up in the late afternoon. My chest felt tight, and my throat was dry. I walked back to the atelier, hoping to clear my head. The painting still leaned against the wall, faced away. I hesitated before turning it around. The air in the room felt heavier. I turned the painting around and stared at the face. It looked more detailed than I remembered. The eyes seemed more complete even though I hadn't finished them. The angles of the jaw and the shading on the cheeks looked deeper. My heart rate jumped. I felt this strong urge to cover it up, but I also felt compelled to continue. I felt like I had to finish what I started. I grabbed a brush and began filling in the background. I used dull colors, a mix of gray and dark blue. With each stroke, I felt the tension in my arm build up. My wrist started to cramp. My breathing got faster. I heard a faint whisper like someone was behind me, but I saw no one. I turned the music on my phone to try to drown out the house noises. The music didn't help. I still heard that low whisper. It sounded like a man's voice. I couldn't make out words. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Around midnight, I put the brush down. I had spent hours on the background and part of the suit. The portrait looked more complete, but the man's face seemed even angrier. The lips pressed together like he was ready to speak. The eyes had a sharp glare. I felt dizzy. I heard my stomach growl but couldn't stomach the idea of food. The smell from the painting seemed stronger. I saw that the paint on the canvas still looked fresh, even on the older sections that should have dried long ago. I stepped out of the room and splashed water on my face in the bathroom. My hands shook. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and I had dark circles. My head pounded. I heard a creak from the atelier. I dried my face and walked back. The lights flickered for a moment. Then everything went still. The painting was exactly where I left it. The man's eyes almost looked like they followed me as I moved across the room. I felt my pulse thud in my ears. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind. I tried to sleep again, but each time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint whisper. I sat up in bed, breathing hard. I thought about leaving the house. I even considered driving to a hotel for the night. But I felt silly running away from a canvas. I forced myself to go back to the atelier. I stood there looking at the painting. The man's expression seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at him. I would glance away, then look back, and the face appeared to shift slightly. My scalp tingled. My mouth felt dry. My heart raced. I decided I had to finish it. Maybe that would break whatever hold it had on me. I spent the next day focused on the details. I refined the shadows under the chin, added texture to the hair, and tried to soften the expression. It didn't work. Each time I tried to lighten the mouth or raise the eyebrows, I ended up with a darker look. The paint seemed to move under my brush. I've been painting for years, so I know how paint usually behaves. This felt different. My brush strokes dried in odd ways. I started to feel weak, like the longer I worked, the less energy I had. My arms felt like lead, and my eyes burned. That night, I stayed up until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I heard faint whispers every few minutes. I thought I saw movement in the corner of the room, like the man in the painting stepped forward. But each time I turned, it was just the painting on the easel. I reached out and touched the canvas. It was cold. The surface felt slightly damp, and my fingertips tingled. I backed away and sat down, trying to catch my breath. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up slumped in a chair. My neck hurt and my left hand was numb. I heard a tapping sound. I realized it was my foot shaking against the floor. I felt disoriented. I looked at the painting. The man's eyes seemed more detailed than before. I could see tiny veins in the corners. I know I hadn't painted those. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. My stomach turned and I rushed to the bathroom to splash my face with cold water. When I came back, the portrait seemed to vibrate in my vision. I blinked several times. My chest felt like it was in a vice. I walked closer and saw that the eyes looked red. I didn't paint them red. I had used a standard mix of brown and black for the iris. Now they looked bloodshot. I touched the surface. My fingers felt a slight warmth, and I recoiled. A wave of nausea hit me. The stench coming off the canvas made my eyes water. It smelled like rotten wood and chemicals. My mind kept telling me to stop working on it, but I couldn't pull away. I forced myself to clean my brushes. I filled a bucket with water and soap, then I rubbed the bristles until they stopped smelling like turpentine. I stared at the painting the whole time, waiting for it to do something obvious. The man's face stayed still, but the tension remained. I felt like I was in a staring contest. My hands were unsteady as I wiped the brushes dry. At some point, I realized I hadn't eaten a proper meal in a day. My stomach felt hollow. I made myself a sandwich in the kitchen, but I couldn't taste anything. I chewed mechanically, my mind stuck on the painting. After I swallowed the last bite, I walked back to the atelier. I noticed the painting had shifted slightly on the easel, as if someone had nudged it. I knew I left it centered. Now it was a few inches to the right. My lungs felt tight, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. I decided to add the finishing touches. I mixed a final batch of paint. My hand shook as I moved the brush toward the man's face. I tried to add a soft highlight to each eye, hoping it would give the portrait a calmer expression. My entire arm went tense. The brush fell from my hand. My breath caught in my throat. I heard a clear whisper. It was a single word, though I couldn't make it out. My knees threatened to buckle. I braced myself against the easel. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I managed to pick the brush up again, but something in my gut told me to stop. I tried one more stroke on the right eye, and the paint spread in a way I didn't control. It smeared across the pupil, giving it a sharper glare. I felt a sudden chill on my neck. My hand jerked back and I knocked over a jar of dirty water. It spilled across the floor, soaking a rag. I cursed under my breath and stepped away. At that moment, the overhead light flickered again. The man's face looked like it turned slightly, as if tracking me. My arms broke out in goosebumps. My breathing became ragged. I couldn't stand being in that room anymore. I backed up until I hit the door frame. My heart thumped, and I felt sweat trickle down my temple. I left the atelier and closed the door. I could barely move my legs. I sat on the bottom stair in the hallway, burying my face in my hands. My mind kept replaying that whisper. I tried to steady my breathing. I could still smell that awful odor clinging to my clothes. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand. I went back to my bedroom and locked the door. I lay down on the bed. My eyes wouldn't stay shut. Every time I tried to sleep, my body twitched, and I thought I heard the floor creak outside. I haven't touched that painting since. It's still in the atelier. I can feel it in the house at night. The air gets colder, and I hear faint whispers. My eyes burn whenever I walk past the closed door. Sometimes I hear a light tapping from inside the room, like someone knocking on the easel. I haven't decided what to do about it. Part of me wants to destroy it, but I can't bring myself to set fire to a piece of art, no matter how wrong it feels. For now, I just avoid that room and I try to ignore the strange sense that the portrait is waiting for me to come back and finish it. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but that's what's happening. That's my life right now in this old house with that unsettling painting. And that's all I can say about it. I still remember the first time I stepped into that abandoned hotel lobby. I walked through the open front doors and saw dust rising as my shoes landed on the old marble floor. The air smelled stale, and the slightest movement stirred particles that seemed to float around like tiny specks in a dull spotlight. There was no furniture left, only a few broken chairs scattered near a crumbling reception desk. The ceiling had intricate plaster patterns, but many parts had chipped away. Wires and metal rods stuck out at strange angles. I felt uneasy, but I had a job to do. I'm Anthony. I teach architecture at a university, and I've spent the last decade studying historical buildings. Most of my focus has been on grand hotels from the early 20th century. This particular hotel, once known for its luxury, was about to be demolished. My role was to record its original design elements. I had a camera with me, a notebook, and some old drawings that I found in city archives. I wasn't there for sightseeing. I wanted to document every detail before bulldozers took it all away. I started on the ground floor. The layout was massive, almost like a maze. There were wide corridors, some leading to smaller rooms and others branching off toward staircases on the sides. I remember turning a corner and stopping in my tracks. I saw dark patches on the marble that didn't match anything in the original blueprints. These shapes had no consistent pattern. They twisted across the floor in a way that drew my attention immediately. I knelt down. The marks were ingrained in the surface, not stains that could be wiped away. They appeared random at first. I ran my fingertips over them. They had a slight texture like fine scratches, but arranged in a pattern I couldn't identify. I looked at the faded blueprint in my hand. Nothing indicated extra lines or shapes on the marble. They weren't normal cracks either. The building had a lot of structural issues, but these lines seemed deliberate. I photographed them, made some notes, then moved on. The next day I returned to the hotel early. I wanted better light for my pictures. I walked back to the same corridor and crouched to examine the floor again. At first I thought I had taken a wrong turn. The markings weren't in the same spots. I stood up and checked the peeling wallpaper on the walls, trying to confirm if I was in the right place. The corridor layout was the same, but the marks were off by several feet. They also looked slightly different in shape. A chill ran through me as I realized these lines had moved. That didn't make sense to me. Floors don't shift overnight, not in a building like this. I told myself it might be a trick of the light. Maybe I had misread the distance between the patterns and the wall. I took more pictures. I wrote more notes. I told myself I would compare everything later in my office. I continued my survey of the building, checking the old ballroom, the dining area, and the main lobby. The same corridor kept coming back to my mind, though. I couldn't stop thinking about those shifting marks on the marble. By the time I reached the front door to leave, dusk was settling and the hallway was darker than before. My head hurt and my mouth felt dry. I realized I had been inside for hours without taking a break. That night I tried to review my photos. My phone battery was low and the pictures appeared grainy. The lines on the floor in the new pictures were undeniably different from those in the previous day's shots. They had changed angles and their shapes were more elongated. I stayed up late, zooming in on every detail. I didn't find any practical explanation. On the third day, I arrived with more equipment. I brought a better camera, extra batteries, a flashlight, and a small measuring tape. I had one goal: to pin down the exact position of those lines and see if something physical was happening to the floor. Once I was back in the corridor, I marked the edges of the shapes with masking tape. I measured distances from the wall. I took several pictures from multiple angles. I moved through the rest of the hotel, making notes on the architecture. I passed through narrow hallways with missing ceiling panels. I heard my own footsteps echo. Sometimes, the echo sounded delayed, as if the sound had traveled a great distance before returning. I tried not to dwell on that. I reminded myself that old structures have strange acoustics. The windows were boarded up in some areas, and the light was weak. I turned on my flashlight. The beam caught swirls of dust in the air. I felt something like motion sickness. My stomach tightened. I leaned against a wall until the feeling passed. Later, I came back to check the taped marks. I froze when I saw that one strip of tape had peeled off the floor and was stuck in a different spot. The lines beneath it had shifted. They looked thicker. I lifted my flashlight and scanned the entire area. The corridor felt heavier somehow, as if the air had gained weight. I glanced around for a draft or a loose board. Nothing. I decided to remove the rest of the tape. I just took more photos and left. At home, I tried to sleep, but I kept replaying the moment I saw the tape in the wrong position. I tossed and turned. The next morning I returned earlier than usual. My head felt clogged, and I was tired. I wanted to wrap up the corridor survey, then move on to the rest of the hotel. I told myself not to obsess over a few strange scratches on the floor. That plan didn't last. I found myself back at the corridor right away. The marks looked more pronounced, as if they had grown deeper. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard a metallic scraping sound coming from behind me. I spun around with my flashlight. An old luggage cart was at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't there the day before. I walked over to examine it. It had rusted wheels and a torn piece of fabric dangling from its frame. A faint set of lines trailed behind it on the marble, almost like the marks I was studying. I crouched and touched the floor. The lines were new, and they matched the pattern near the luggage cart. It looked like something had dragged the cart, but I didn't see any footprints or any other indications of movement. My pulse was racing. I tried to calm down by writing quick observations. Luggage cart, corridor, lines behind it. No sign of who moved it. Then I heard another echo from deeper in the hallway. It didn't sound like wind. It was more like a distant rumble or a low hum that pulsed through the walls. I decided to check the blueprint again. I realized I had no idea which wing of the hotel I was in. I swore under my breath when I noticed that I must have turned left or right at some point without marking my route. The corridor seemed endless. Some doors were missing, some were locked. The layout made no sense compared to the original floor plan I carried. My phone battery was dropping and I was sweating. The place felt too hot all of a sudden. I found a corner to sit and gather my thoughts. I checked my watch. 4 hours had passed since I entered, but it felt like 30 minutes. My stomach growled. I rummaged in my bag, found an energy bar, and ate it quickly. Then I got up and tried to retrace my steps. The corridor seemed narrower, or maybe it was my nerves. The plaster on the walls had small cracks that looked fresh. The ceiling lights were all dead, so I kept the flashlight on. My hand trembled. As I turned another corner, I saw an old chair in the middle of the hallway. It was an office chair with torn upholstery. I remembered seeing it near the reception desk a few days ago. Now it was here, and the floor around it had the same swirling lines. I stepped closer. I noticed a scratchy noise. The chair moved a bit, an inch or so, rotating on one broken wheel. I jumped back. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there watching. It didn't move again. My heart was pounding so hard that my chest hurt. I looked at the walls for any cracks that might let in a breeze strong enough to shift a heavy chair. Nothing. I tapped the chair lightly with my foot. It made a squeak, but it didn't move on its own. I noticed the swirl pattern on the floor was deeper around the chair legs, almost like it had etched itself into the marble. I saw faint scuff marks around it, as if it had spun in circles. I took a dozen pictures, checking the timestamp on each one. I tried to find the exit. My plan was to leave for the day, compare my notes and see if I was missing something obvious. But the corridors seemed to loop back on themselves. I walked for another hour, passing through the same dust-covered lounge area twice. My sense of direction felt scrambled. I kept hearing that faint rumbling noise. Sometimes it was close, sometimes more distant, but it never faded completely. The feeling of nausea returned, and my vision blurred at the edges. I had to sit again, leaning on a cold marble column. The column had more of those swirling marks near its base, but these were lighter, thinner lines. I took a few deep breaths, drank some water, and forced myself to move on. Eventually, I found the main staircase. I recognized the chipped handrail. I ran down the steps, ignoring the throbbing in my legs. When I reached the lobby, I noticed an odd echo again. My footsteps bounced around the room in a way that didn't match the space. It made me dizzy. I saw a few half-broken tables that hadn't been there before. They formed a line across the center of the lobby, each with a dark scuff trailing behind it. The scuffs matched the corridor lines. Something had dragged these tables here. I forced myself to keep walking. I finally reached the front doors. I stepped outside and the late afternoon sun hurt my eyes. I stayed in my car for a long time, letting the engine run so I could cool off in the air conditioning. I felt like I had left a different world, one that twisted everything normal into something I couldn't explain. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were shaking. I tried to calm down by calling a colleague at the university, but I got no answer. I just drove home, my mind racing with thoughts about the shifting marks. Over the next few days, I found myself going back repeatedly. I couldn't stay away. I wanted answers. Each time I brought more measuring tools, more reference materials, more flashlights. The lines grew more elaborate. They sprawled across the floor like a branching pattern that led nowhere. Some days, I heard scraping sounds in the distance. Other times, I found objects in positions they shouldn't be. One day, a long mirror had been pulled from a side closet and placed in the corridor. It was angled toward the floor, where the marks were the strongest. I saw my own reflection distorted by a crack in the glass. My face looked pale. My eyes had dark circles. My obsession grew. I stopped paying attention to the rest of my architectural survey. I focused on those strange patterns. I measured, photographed, and sketched. But nothing stayed consistent from one visit to the next. Sometimes I thought I sensed a faint vibration under my feet, like a low-level hum that crept up my legs. When I tried to stand still, my knees trembled. My notes turned messy and repetitive. I lost track of time. I would arrive in the morning, then find myself stumbling out at night with no clear memory of the hours in between. My phone battery drained faster. My legs ached. My throat felt raw from breathing stale air. I realized I was talking to myself, muttering about the lines. I repeated measurements aloud, hoping to pin them down. But they always changed. One afternoon, I stood near the center of the grand lobby. The marks covered a large section of the floor. I felt lightheaded. I listened to my own breathing. Then the overhead light fixture, a huge chandelier that had been hanging crooked, started to sway. It made a creaking sound. I backed away. The chain above it groaned, but the chandelier stayed in place. I looked down and saw new lines forming under it, crossing the older ones. They seemed to appear in real time, inch by inch. My breathing went shallow. I lifted my camera to record, but my hands were shaking so hard that the footage came out blurry. I felt a wave of nausea that almost knocked me off my feet. I don't know how I got out that day. I remember stumbling through the corridors, hearing furniture scrape in nearby rooms. Each hallway felt longer than before. Every turn led me past more twisted shapes. The swirling marks on the floor were everywhere, as if the entire building was covered in them. The walls had cracks that followed similar lines. My flashlight flickered. I bumped against a door. It opened. I found a side exit that led into an alley. I staggered outside and sank to my knees. My body trembled. My shirt was soaked in sweat again. I haven't gone back since that afternoon. I still have all the photos and notes. When I look at them, I see how the marks changed day by day, sometimes hour by hour. I see the objects that moved on their own. I have pictures of the same corridor on different mornings, each time with the lines shifted or expanded. I even have that short, shaky video clip of the chandelier swaying while the floor below it formed new patterns. None of it fits any logical explanation. I've reported my findings to the university, but they're skeptical. The hotel is scheduled for demolition next week. Part of me wonders if the place will simply vanish on its own. Part of me wants to see what happens when the bulldozers arrive, but I can't bring myself to step inside again. Every time I think about it, my pulse speeds up and my mouth goes dry. I remember the sensation of losing time in those corridors, the sound of something scraping against the marble just out of sight, the sudden movements of heavy furniture without a single person in the room. Those memories still keep me awake. Sometimes I imagine I hear those rumbling echoes in my apartment. I blink and the feeling passes. That's my story. I went there to study architecture, to document a piece of history. I found something else instead. The marks on the floor were not cracks or stains. They kept shifting whenever I turned away. They left behind a sense of dread that I can't shake off. I don't know if anybody else will believe me, but I saw it. I felt it. I got lost in that endless maze. And I'm sure those lines are still shifting right now, waiting for the next curious fool who decides to wander inside. I still remember the first time I heard those whispers. It was early morning and I was standing at the edge of a trail that nobody had officially explored. My employer wanted me to map that area and bring back detailed notes. I had done this kind of work in several forests, but I had never set foot in this particular region before. There were stories about people seeing figures in the distance and feeling strange chills, but I had always shrugged off that kind of rumor. I didn't believe in ghosts or hidden spirits. I believed in careful planning, a good map, and solid knowledge of the land. I'm Kevin. I've been a guide for most of my life. I know how to follow tracks, how to set up a safe camp, and how to read the wind. I know the smell of damp moss and the rough texture of centuries-old tree bark. I know how to handle sudden changes in the weather. I know how to keep my head when people panic in the middle of a nighttime trail. None of that prepared me for what happened in that place. My gear was basic. I had a backpack with dried food, a canteen of water, a couple of compasses, a map that showed only the broader region, and a notebook. My plan was simple. I would move into the uncharted area, mark the coordinates on my GPS, compare them with my compasses, and draw out the missing pieces of the topography. I would note anything unusual, any landmarks or tricky spots, and then come back. That was it. But I sensed something off as soon as I passed the old boundary marker. The trees grew so tall and thick that most of the sunlight got lost before it hit the ground. Only thin beams of light touched the mossy floor. The air smelled stale, like a room that hasn't been aired out in weeks. I walked carefully. The ground was covered in moist leaves and tangled roots. There were vines hanging from above, and I had to push them aside. I noticed patches of mushrooms around the bases of thick trunks. The bark on those trunks looked warped, almost like it had lumps and ridges that resembled faces, but I dismissed that as a trick of the light. I kept checking my compass, verifying my direction. I made small notes in my notebook. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary except for the silence. Usually, forests have birds, insects, or small animals rustling in the undergrowth. This one felt muted. Occasionally, I heard a distant rustle of branches or a random caw, but it felt quieter than anywhere else I'd been. I pressed on until midday. The trail was almost non-existent, so I followed the general direction on my map. I paused to eat a quick snack and check my bearings. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, but it was close. It sounded like a voice trying to speak my name. My first instinct was that someone else was out there. Maybe another adventurer or some researcher. But I looked around and I saw no footprints, no sign of campfires, no indication that anyone else had been through. I listened again, staying perfectly still. My heart thumped. The whisper came again. It sounded like Kevin, but drawn out like the wind passing through hollow wood. I tried to locate the direction of the sound, but it seemed to move. 1 second it was to my left, the next second behind me. I called out, "Hello?" No one answered. The voice stopped. I waited a few minutes, scribbling a note in my pad. Heard whisper, possibly calling my name. Then I moved on, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the quiet. For the rest of the afternoon, I followed the usual steps. I measured distances, recorded small sketches, and watched the sun's angle. But I kept hearing soft sounds that resembled voices. They stayed just out of range. They never formed full sentences. It was more like a murmur that rose and fell in the breeze. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to turn back. I had a job to do, and I had handled plenty of weird moments in remote areas. As the sun started to drop, I picked a spot for my camp. I chose a level stretch of ground next to an old tree with thick roots. I unpacked my tent and set it up carefully. I checked the immediate surroundings for animal dens or wasp nests, but I found nothing. I set up my small stove, heated some water, and prepared a meal. The smell of warm food was comforting. I sat on a small folding stool and wrote out my notes for the day. Then the temperature dipped fast. One moment I was comfortable in a light jacket. The next I was shivering. The air felt heavy against my skin. My breath came out in white puffs. I shone my flashlight around. The trees formed a wall of shadows. I didn't see anything moving. I walked around the immediate area, scanning with my flashlight. The forest floor was littered with wet leaves, and the undergrowth looked undisturbed. I didn't see footprints or any sign of large animals, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. When I returned to my camp, I noticed both my compasses gave readings that made no sense. One pointed northeast, the other pointed south, even though I had placed them side by side. I tapped them gently, thinking the needles were stuck. No change. I grabbed my spare compass from my backpack. Same issue. The GPS also started to glitch, losing satellite signal intermittently. That was the first time I felt a knot in my stomach. I checked my watch. It was working fine, at least. I decided I would finish my meal, secure my gear, and get some rest. Sleep didn't come easily. I heard movement outside. It wasn't the steady steps of an animal. It was more like a slithering sound or a series of faint clicks. Whenever I sat up, everything went quiet. Then, after a few seconds, the faint noise started again. It was too dark to see much beyond the range of my flashlight, and I wasn't eager to go wandering. My heart pounded, but I told myself to stay calm. I knew that panic would only make things worse. Eventually, I managed to drift off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a jolt. I sat straight up in my sleeping bag. A cold sweat covered my neck and back. My arms felt numb. I heard whispers again, but they were louder now. They came from all around, overlapping in some strange chant. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded rhythmic, like a ritual. My breathing got faster. I strained to listen. The voices rose and fell, almost like waves. Then I saw something that made my stomach clench. There, between the trees, I spotted faint shapes. They looked like faces without bodies, hovering near the trunks. Each face was pale and blurry, almost like it was made of fog. Their eyes were dark, and they all faced me. My flashlight flickered, and each time it lit up the spot, the shapes vanished. Then they appeared again a few feet away, watching me. I felt my skin prickle. My mouth went dry. I didn't smell anything unusual, but I could sense that the air was colder near those shapes. My breath rattled in my throat. I ducked back inside the tent, zipped it up, and tried to think clearly. My thoughts raced. I wanted to rationalize what I had seen, but it was too vivid. I tried to slow my breathing, telling myself this could be some sort of light refraction or trick of my flashlight. I had never experienced anything like this before. I forced myself to stay still, thinking I would wait it out until morning. The whispers continued, but they stayed distant enough that I could ignore them if I focused on my own breathing. After a while, I guess I dozed off from exhaustion. At dawn, I stepped outside. The temperature felt more normal. The forest was still quiet. I looked around, searching for footprints or any evidence of what happened. I found nothing except my own tracks. I realized my hands were shaking as I packed up my gear. I told myself I would push deeper into the area, map it as quickly as possible, and then head back. I hated the idea of another night out there. But I had responsibilities, and I wanted to finish the job. I moved forward along a slope that was covered in slick moss and twisted roots. I had to keep my balance with each step. A few times I slipped, catching myself on low-hanging vines. The canopy overhead was so thick that it created a dim gloom. My flashlight barely helped. I felt like I was walking through a maze of tree trunks and rocks coated with lichen. My boots squished through layers of wet leaves. I tried my compasses again and got the same nonsense readings as before. The GPS flickered in and out, sometimes showing my position, sometimes losing signal. Around midday, the whispers returned. They came in short bursts, like someone calling my name in a hushed tone, then stopping. My nerves were on edge. My shoulders felt tight and my forehead was damp with sweat, despite the cool air. I swallowed and tried to keep my pace. The forest floor dipped down into a small valley, where the light was even weaker. I spotted a clearing with a cluster of smooth rocks. I decided to rest there, maybe check my coordinates again. As I approached those rocks, a wave of cold air hit me, and it almost knocked the wind out of me. My teeth chattered. The whispers turned into a soft chant. I set my backpack down and pulled out my water. My fingers felt stiff. I took a gulp, trying to steady my breathing. The chant got louder. I thought I saw movement near the tree line, so I stood up, scanning the area with my flashlight. That's when I noticed figures moving between the tree trunks. They were elongated shapes, grayish, like shadows that had broken free from the real objects. They shifted in and out of view. My mind raced. I considered leaving right then, but I had come so far. I needed to mark the edge of that valley and verify if there was a natural boundary or any significant landmark. I forced myself to move carefully toward the tree line. My legs felt heavy. My heart pounded in my chest. Each step seemed to echo in the silence. When I reached the trees, I saw what looked like an old path, but it was blocked by collapsed branches and thick vines. I noted it in my pad, then turned around quickly. I couldn't stay there any longer. I decided I would circle back and try another route. As I walked away from that area, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The temperature rose to a more normal level, but the whispers lingered, trailing me. Sometimes they sounded like soft laughter. Sometimes they echoed my footsteps. By mid-afternoon, I realized my sense of direction was off. I wasn't sure if it was because of the compasses failing or because I was too rattled. I tried to find a recognizable landmark. Everything looked the same. The old trees, the moss, the vines, the patches of mushrooms, it all blended together. I felt the tension in my neck and shoulders. My pulse was fast. My mind kept drifting back to those spectral faces at night. I wondered if they would appear again. I dreaded the idea of setting up camp in this place, but I also knew wandering in the dark would be even worse. By sunset, I found a relatively flat spot near a large boulder. I decided that would be my campsite for the night. I set up my tent, forcing my hands to stay steady. The night came quickly. The darkness was thick. I prepared a small meal again, chewing without any real appetite. I kept my flashlight within reach. I heard branches creaking overhead. A few times I thought I heard footsteps nearby, but when I poked my head outside, I saw nothing. Only the stillness of the forest. Sometime around midnight, the whispers grew louder. They circled my campsite. My mouth went dry. My whole body felt tense. I clenched my hands into fists. The chanting started up again, rising in intensity. Then I saw them. The faces. They appeared between the trees, hovering in the air. Their mouths moved in unison with the chant. Their eyes were fixed on me. I noticed the area around them looked distorted, like heat waves or ripples in water, but it was cold instead of hot. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at them, hoping they would disappear. They flickered and vanished, but only for a moment. Then they returned a few yards to the left. I scrambled out of my tent, shining the light wildly. My skin crawled. I noticed an odd smell, like wet stone and old leaves. The chanting pounded in my head. I stood still, trying to think of a plan. The chanting got louder. My flashlight started to flicker. The temperature plummeted. My teeth chattered. I forced myself to step forward, shining the beam at the faces. They flickered again. Then the chanting stopped. The forest became silent, almost like a vacuum. My ears buzzed from the sudden stillness. I stayed there panting, waiting for the next move. But the shapes faded away. I slumped against a tree. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My legs were shaky. I waited a few minutes, scanning the area with the flashlight. Nothing. The temperature slowly returned to normal. I could hear my own ragged breathing and the rustle of leaves in the slight wind. I crawled back into my tent. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise made me jump. My mind replayed those faces and the chanting. By the time dawn arrived, I made up my mind. I had gathered enough data for a partial map. I had noted key points. That would have to be enough. I knew I wasn't equipped to stay longer. I packed my gear as fast as I could and started retracing my path. My compasses were still useless, but the GPS worked just enough for me to find a general route back. I moved quickly, ignoring the cold spots and occasional whispers that popped up behind me. I focused on each step, pushing away every sign of fear. When I finally reached the old boundary marker, I felt a wave of relief. The air smelled fresher, and the sunlight looked brighter. I took one last glance behind me. The forest was silent, but I felt like something was there, lurking just beyond sight. I didn't linger. I had done my job. I had my notes, my sketches, and my recordings of those strange compass failures. I headed out, determined to finalize my report. Now I'm back, telling this story. I can't fully explain what happened in that forest. The compasses and the GPS readings will confirm something was off with the magnetic field or the atmosphere. The temperature changes might have a scientific explanation, but those faces and whispers, they're harder to dismiss. I still get chills when I think about them. I haven't gone back there, and I'm not planning to anytime soon. Some places aren't meant to be understood, and some voices should stay in the dark where they belong. I almost didn't accept the mirror when the stranger showed up. He wore a dark coat and his eyes never settled on one spot. He told me it was a rare Victorian piece, valuable enough to belong in my shop. I run a small antiquary that I inherited from my grandparents. I don't believe in haunted items or cursed artifacts. I believe in old furniture, dust, and the smell of attic boxes. But something about his request felt off. He insisted I keep the mirror in the back room until he came back. He left without giving me his name. I stood there staring at the mirror. It had two reflective surfaces arranged at an odd angle. At a glance, it looked like any other antique mirror, but I noticed smudges and faint streaks across the glass. I had an urge to clean it right away. I'm Thomas. I'm not a superstitious guy. I don't jump at shadows, and I don't believe in curses. I handle old furniture, paintings, coins, rugs, and everything else people toss aside from old estates. It's my job to take these items, clean them, price them, and sell them. My shop is a cramped space with shelves of porcelain figurines, rows of dusty books, and all sorts of chairs, tables, and lamps spread out. Yellow lights hang from the ceiling and cast a warm glow over everything. I have a basement too. The basement is always stuffy and dark, full of boxes, broken chairs, and random junk my grandparents left behind. That's my whole world. The smell of old wood, dusty boxes, and a locked cash register. The day I got the mirror, I carried it to a corner in the back of the main showroom, near some old paintings. The frame looked chipped in a few places, so I decided to check if it needed repairs. I put it on a wooden table with a strong overhead lamp. The mirror had some kind of gold-toned frame with decorative carvings. I could see small cracks in the wood. The two reflective panels formed a subtle V-shape, so if you stood in front of it, you could see more than one angle of your reflection. I grabbed a rag and a bottle of cleaning solution. I started wiping away dust and spots. Nothing unusual. But then I felt like someone stood behind me. I caught a shape in the corner of my eye, reflected in the mirror. I turned around, expecting to see the stranger or maybe one of my part-time helpers, but the space behind me was empty. No movement, no shadow, nothing. I chalked it up to a trick of the light. These old mirrors sometimes have tarnished spots that can distort reflections. My heart rate went up for a second, and then I told myself to calm down. I went back to cleaning, focusing on the corners of the glass. That's when I saw it again. A faint silhouette passing behind me, too quick to identify. I dropped the rag on the floor. I spun around, and again no one was there. I felt a chill on my arms. The back of my neck prickled. I looked at the reflection more carefully. At first I only saw myself, the shelves, and the back wall. But in the second reflective panel, I noticed something that wasn't part of my shop. The angle showed a hallway that didn't belong to my building, It looked like a narrow corridor, kind of dim, with a patterned floor I've never seen before. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to figure out if maybe the reflection was capturing an odd view from a mirror behind me or something, but there was no second mirror anywhere near that spot. I got a weird feeling in my stomach. I decided to test the angles. I moved a small wooden stool behind me and watched its reflection in the first panel. I saw it there. That was normal. Then I turned slightly and tried to see the stool in the second panel. Instead of seeing the stool, I saw the same narrow hallway with a door at the far end. I couldn't see the stool at all. It was like that second panel was showing some other place entirely. I felt my pulse throbbing in my ears. I checked behind me again. The stool was right there, but the mirror's second panel refused to reflect it. I decided I'd had enough for one day. I covered the mirror with a large sheet. I told myself I'd look at it again tomorrow, maybe with better lighting or a different approach. The rest of the evening I stayed busy sorting through boxes. I found old letters, a few vintage pocket watches, and some porcelain teacups. I forced myself not to think about the mirror, but my mind kept drifting back to it. I locked up the shop around 8 p.m., and I went upstairs to my small office to finish paperwork. My living space is a few blocks away, but sometimes I stay late. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps downstairs. My stomach tightened. I was sure I'd locked up. I stood up, walked to the top of the stairs, and listened. I heard faint creaks, like someone pacing around. Then I heard a sound like nails scraping wood. It came from the corner where I'd left the covered mirror. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a long metal ruler that I used to measure furniture. I went down the stairs slowly. My hands felt damp, and my throat felt dry. The lights were off in the showroom, but I could see shapes in the darkness. The old chairs, the shelves, everything was in its place. I turned on the flashlight and swept the beam around. The corner with the covered mirror was still. I didn't see anyone. Then I heard a scratch again. It sounded like it came from behind the sheet. I stepped closer, shining the light on it. The sheet moved slightly, as if something pressed against it from behind. I felt my heart pounding. I waited, but nothing else happened. I pulled the sheet down in one quick motion. I aimed the flashlight at the mirror's surface. It just showed me and the reflection of my store, but I noticed the second panel had a faint flickering light in it. I leaned closer, and the flashlight beam showed something that looked like a small lamp inside that hallway. I watched for a few seconds, and then the light in the second panel vanished, like someone turned it off on the other side. I stepped back. I felt unsteady, like I wanted to run upstairs and lock the door, but I didn't. Instead, I covered the mirror again, making sure no part of it was visible, and then I left the showroom. I locked up carefully, checked all the windows, and went home. I couldn't sleep right away. The next morning I came in around 9. I kept telling myself that I must have imagined the weird hallway. Maybe the second reflection was some old trick built into the glass. I've heard about illusions in vintage mirrors, something to do with the layers of silver backing or tinted glass. I also remembered my fear from last night, which now felt embarrassing. I decided to approach the mirror like any other item. I went downstairs to the showroom. The sheet was still in place, everything looked normal. I uncovered the mirror to see if anything had changed. The reflection looked ordinary for a moment. I moved around, checking both panels. The first panel showed me in the back wall. The second panel still showed that narrow hallway. This time, the door at the end was half open. I blinked a few times, trying to see if maybe it was a reflection of my basement door or a piece of furniture. It wasn't. The floor pattern, the walls, and the half-open door didn't match anything I had in my shop. I decided to move the mirror to the basement where I keep extra inventory. I thought maybe the different lighting would help me figure this out. I carried it carefully down the wooden steps. The basement felt more humid than usual. I turned on the overhead bulb and cleared a space on a sturdy workbench. I propped the mirror against the wall. The basement is cluttered, so there aren't any large mirrors around for reflections to bounce off. I studied the second panel again. I still saw that hallway. The door was closed this time. I tapped on the glass with my knuckles. It felt like a normal mirror. I walked around the basement, shining a small flashlight to check for hidden angles or potential illusions. Nothing explained what I saw. I decided I would ignore it for a few hours. I had customers upstairs and a business to run. I spent the day sorting new arrivals, pricing them, and chatting with a couple of regulars. I sold an old rocking chair and a set of silver utensils. In the back of my mind, though, I kept thinking about the mirror in the basement. I also noticed the store felt colder than usual. Around 6 p.m., I closed up a bit early. I wanted time to examine the mirror again. I turned on all the basement lights and stood in front of the mirror with a determined attitude. I told myself I was going to figure out what was going on. I watched my reflection in the first panel. I saw my tired face, my plain shirt, my short hair, my slightly stooped posture. I stared at the second panel. At first, it was just that hallway, empty. Then I saw movement. It looked like a black shape crossing from left to right at the far end, near the door. My chest felt tight and I swallowed hard. I felt sweat under my arms. I approached the mirror until my nose was almost touching it. The shape didn't come closer. I tried to tap the glass again. I heard only a dull thud. When I moved my head to the side, the hallway's angle shifted slightly. I could see more of that strange floor pattern. I noticed a worn-out rug. Then the black shape glided back the other way, and I heard a faint scraping sound, like something sliding against the floor. I jumped back, nearly knocking over a stack of boxes behind me. I decided to try something else. I grabbed a small hand mirror and held it in front of the mirror. I wanted to see if I could capture that second hallway reflection in the hand mirror, but the hand mirror only showed a reflection of the first panel. No matter how I angled it, I couldn't get the hallway to appear in the handheld reflection. It was like that second panel refused to be captured by anything else. I started to feel a persistent anxiety that wouldn't go away. My chest felt heavy. I kept thinking I should contact the stranger who left the mirror. But he didn't give me a name or phone number. I had no way to reach him. I tried searching online for Victorian mirrors with double panels. I found some references to double reflection illusions and old parlor tricks, but nothing described a separate place visible in a second panel. I felt stuck. That night I stayed late again. I heard more footsteps and scraping sounds from the basement. I grabbed my flashlight and forced myself to go down there. I felt like my legs were made of lead. Each step down the stairs made me tense up. I reached the bottom and turned on the overhead light. The mirror stood where I left it, leaning against the workbench. The second panel showed darkness, but I noticed a flicker, like a small flame dancing in the hallway. I leaned in and I saw the black shape near the door. It looked like it was crouched low, as if pressed against the corner. My breath came in short bursts. I clutched the flashlight, aiming it at the mirror, not that it would help. Then the shape straightened and I heard a knock from somewhere behind the glass. I stepped back. My hands shook. I thought maybe it was just in my head, but I heard it again. A clear, deliberate knock from inside the hallway. I felt trapped. I didn't want to keep this mirror anymore. I thought about taking a hammer to it, but I was afraid of what that might cause. I decided to cover it again and hope that the stranger would return soon. I grabbed a thick old blanket from a pile of linens. As I reached out to drape it over the mirror, I saw the black shape shift in the reflection. It rushed toward the surface, and I heard a loud scraping sound like nails dragging across glass. I threw the blanket over the mirror. I heard one final screech, then silence. My hands were trembling. I stood there for several seconds, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I shut the basement lights off and hurried upstairs. I locked every door, turned off the main lights, and left. I went home, tried to calm down, but my hands were still shaking. That night, I hardly slept. I pictured that black shape in my head every time I closed my eyes. I also worried about what might happen if it found a way out of that mirror. The next morning, I considered calling a professional restorer or a mirror specialist, but I realized I'd sound insane. I returned to the shop. The basement felt colder than usual. When I pulled back the blanket, the mirror's surface looked dull. The second panel was dark. There was no sign of the hallway. I exhaled, feeling a bit of relief. I still wanted to get rid of the damn thing. I decided to move it back upstairs and stick a not for sale tag on it, hoping the stranger would come back. He had said he would return for it at some point. Around noon, as I was moving the mirror upstairs, I thought I saw the corner of that hallway flicker in the second panel, but it was faint and faded. I set the mirror against the wall in the back of the showroom. For the rest of the day, I kept hearing sounds behind me whenever I walked near it. Light knocks and scraping noises, always brief. One of my customers commented that the store felt drafty. I tried to act normal. I completed a few sales, and I pretended everything was fine. The day ended quietly. I locked up. I stared at the mirror for a few seconds before leaving. I didn't hear anything or see anything. I switched off the lights and closed the door behind me. I'm still waiting for that stranger to return. I don't know what he intends to do with this mirror. I just want it out of my shop. Every evening I check the basement and the corners of the showroom just in case. I haven't seen the hallway again, but I catch faint footsteps in my peripheral hearing. Sometimes I think I see a shadow from the corner of my eye. I turn, and it's gone. I'm ready to hand it off. I don't want to think about the black shape or the strange corridor. I still don't believe in curses, but I can't explain what's going on with that mirror. Part of me wants to smash it. Another part of me worries about what might come out if I do. So I wait. I keep the mirror covered most of the time. Every now and then, I lift the sheet to check if the second panel looks normal, but it never does. It always shows that place. Maybe the stranger will show up tomorrow. Maybe I'll find a buyer who wants this kind of thing. But for now, the mirror stays, silent and covered, with those faint knocks at night. I hate how my mind goes blank with fear when I hear them. But that's my life with this cursed object. I can't ignore it, and I can't get rid of it. I just hope I don't wake up one morning and find the mirror uncovered or broken, because then I'll have to face whatever might be waiting on the other side. I arrived at the island at sunset. The water was choppy, and the small boat I'd rented kept banging against the rocks. I didn't like the way the waves broke around the shore. The wind felt sharp and cold, and there was that distant rumble of the tide crashing against jagged stone. I remember stepping onto the beach and feeling my boots sink into the wet sand. My heartbeat was steady, but I felt a knot in my gut. I've been in rough weather before, but that place had a different kind of tension. I could almost feel something watching from the high cliffs. I pulled my coat tighter and grabbed my toolbox. The lighthouse stood about 100 yards ahead. It was tall, narrow, and dark. I saw no lights in the windows and no sign of life. My name is Christopher. I spent most of my adult years in the Navy. I got used to storms, isolation, and long nights on a ship. After retiring, I wanted simple jobs. I didn't like sitting around doing nothing, but I also didn't want chaos anymore. So when I found out about this old lighthouse, I jumped on the chance to fix it up. The pay wasn't great, but I figured it would keep me occupied. The local authorities said it hadn't worked for years. They also warned me that people reported strange noises out there. I shrugged it off. I've heard a lot of tall tales at sea, so I didn't think much of it. The climb up to the lighthouse was tough. The rocky path was slippery and the wind kept pushing me sideways. I clenched my jaw and forced each step. The air smelled like salt and damp earth. The setting sun lit up the sky in a dull orange glow, but the light didn't reach the tower's base. By the time I got to the front door, I was out of breath. I stood there panting, studying the door. It was made of old wood reinforced with iron bands. I tried the handle. It stuck at first, but I managed to push the door open. The hinges squeaked. Inside, there was a circular room with stone walls. The floor was rough, dusty cement. I found an old cot against the wall and some half-rotten crates. There was no electricity, so I used my flashlight. The beam caught a set of metal stairs spiraling upward. I could hear the wind whining through cracks in the walls. I also heard a faint dripping sound. Water must have been leaking somewhere. The smell was stale, like old seaweed and moldy wood. I decided to drop my gear on the cot and look around. The caretaker who was here before left a few notes in a folder on the crate. They were short instructions about basic maintenance, but they were incomplete and smudged. There was a mention of the generator stored in a small shed outside. I made a mental note to check it first thing in the morning. I felt hungry, so I took out some canned food and ate cold beans with a spoon. It wasn't satisfying, but I was used to bad meals. After that, I unrolled a sleeping bag on the cot. The temperature dropped fast. The wind outside picked up. I could hear it whistling through the gaps in the stone. Then, around midnight, I heard something else. A thumping noise like a door banging, but it wasn't coming from the outside door. I sat up, flashlight in hand, and listened. My heart was steady, but I was alert. I could tell the thump was coming from above near the top of the lighthouse. I decided to investigate. I climbed the spiral stairs. The steps felt narrow, and I had to duck because the walls closed in around me. My footsteps echoed on the metal. I reached the second level, which was just an empty room with a broken window. The moonlight came through, making patches on the floor. The thumping sound grew louder. I noticed something on the walls. There were scratches and odd carvings. Some looked like outlines of figures with arms and legs. They were crude. I ran my finger over one of them and felt the grooves. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was strange, but I didn't see any movement. I kept going. The third level had more carvings. These looked more detailed. I saw silhouettes with elongated limbs like they were stretched. They almost looked like they were turning or bending. I tried not to stare, but my flashlight kept revealing more as I circled around the stairwell. Then the thump echoed again. It sounded like somebody was trying to push a heavy box on the floor above. I hurried up. The steps creaked under my boots. When I reached the top level, I noticed a massive set of gears and rusted machinery. This was the old mechanism for the light. It was covered in dust and spider webs. The metal housing looked worn. There was no person there. I shone the flashlight around, checking corners. The wind howled through a broken vent. That must have caused the banging, maybe a loose panel. I found the source of the thumping. A rusted piece of sheet metal was slapping against the inner wall whenever the wind blew. I felt relief and a little irritation at my nerves. I climbed a short ladder to check the lantern room. The lens was filthy, and the lamp assembly was old. I figured I would need to take it apart and clean everything if I wanted to get it working again. I decided to do a quick check. I stepped onto a narrow walkway around the lantern and looked at the ocean. The moon was high, and the waves below looked rough. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. Being alone in a tall structure at night made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. I climbed back down to my cot and tried to sleep. The wind kept me awake for a while, and I had a faint headache. At some point, I dozed off. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the generator in the shed. The shed was rusty and smelled like gasoline. I found an old generator with a manual ignition. The fuel tank was almost empty, so I topped it off with a spare can I'd brought. I pulled the cord. It coughed a few times, then roared to life. The noise startled a flock of seagulls perched on some rocks nearby. They took off squawking. I let the generator run to see if it would hold steady. The output gauge was shaky, but it stayed in the green. I was hopeful. I went back inside and flipped a few switches on the old electrical panel. Lights flickered, but I got power in the bottom room. This was progress. I decided to clean the stairs and see if I could remove the rust from the mechanisms at the top. I grabbed a brush, some rags, and a can of penetrating oil. As I climbed up, I passed those strange carvings again. In daylight, I noticed some were more detailed than I remembered. A few looked like multiple silhouettes overlapping. Their poses seemed different than the night before. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I just hadn't seen them clearly. At the top, I got to work on the metal gears. I wiped off layers of dust and grime. I tested a small crank. It turned, but it squealed. I sprayed some oil. I tried it again. It moved more smoothly. I spent hours on that, pausing only to sip water and eat a quick lunch. I felt the sweat in my shirt despite the cold air. The day passed quietly. I only heard the wind and my own scraping tools. By late afternoon, I had the main gear mechanism cleaned enough to rotate. I connected some wiring I'd found in the tower, hoping it would let the generator power the light. I felt tired but determined. I decided to fire everything up to test it. I walked down, started the generator, and returned. I flipped the switch on a small fuse box near the lens. At first, nothing happened. I tapped on the wiring. I was about to give up when the lamp flickered once. I heard a hum. The lens turned slowly, squealing as the gears engaged. Then the bulb glowed. It was weak, but it was a start. I stood there, arms folded, watching the beam rotate across the water. I felt a surge of satisfaction. It was short-lived. As soon as the lamp shone across the room, I saw the carvings on the walls in a bright, direct glare. My throat went dry. Some of the silhouettes seemed bigger. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I turned around. I felt the hair on my arms lift. It was like a static charge in the air. I heard a faint moan from below, somewhere in the lower levels. The generator sputtered. The light flickered, and then stabilized again. I forced myself to keep working, checking the gears. My hands shook. I heard another moan, louder, from down the stairs. I turned off the lamp and decided I'd had enough for the day. Night came fast. The wind grew stronger. I lit a lantern in the bottom room where I slept. I tried to read a small manual about old lighthouse mechanisms, but I couldn't focus. Every now and then, I heard a scraping noise from the stairwell. It sounded like something sliding across the wall. I pointed my flashlight at the stairs but saw nothing. At around 9, the power in the bottom room blinked. The overhead light flickered. I realized I hadn't shut down the generator, so it was still running outside. I went to the door, opened it, and looked toward the shed. The door to the shed was banging in the wind, but I didn't see anyone. I left the door open to let in some fresh air. That's when I noticed the light in the tower flick on by itself. Through the window, I saw the faint beam rotating. It illuminated the rocks and then swept around again. I grabbed my flashlight and ran up the... The first time I walked into that bell tower, the smell of old wood and dust made me pause. My flashlight showed bits of debris on the floor, and I felt a strange chill even with my jacket zipped up. The caretaker led me upstairs without a word, pointed at the rotted beams, then left me alone. He didn't even wait for my questions. It seemed like everyone just wanted to wash their hands of that place. I remember thinking this was just another job, just another church with a damp bell tower. I was wrong. There's something off about that place, and I learned pretty fast that I wasn't alone up there at night. I'm Raymond. I make my living fixing old wood and broken structures. Sometimes I work on barns, sometimes I work on old houses. Churches are usually straightforward. People appreciate craftsmanship, they pay on time, and I don't mind going the extra mile. The bell tower in this church is different, though. It's tall, made of thick beams, and the stairs wind up in a tight spiral. There's a small landing at each turn, but not enough room for 2 people to pass. The caretaker told me the tower had been shut for years, maybe decades, because nobody wanted to deal with the state of the beams or the columns. The place looked ready to collapse in a strong storm. My job was to replace the rotted parts, reinforce the support columns, and get the floor safe again. I only work at night. I find it peaceful, and I don't get as many interruptions. I like the quiet. I like hearing the creak of old wood when I'm sanding or planing. I guess it's a habit I picked up years ago. During the daytime, there's always hustle and bustle in the town. At night, it's just me, my tools, and the job. The first night I started, I hauled my toolbox up the stairs and set a lamp on a makeshift table I made from some spare wood. I took a closer look at the beams. The grain was worn, and there were these carved symbols I'd never seen before. They looked like random shapes, but they were too precise to be accidental. Each one was about the size of my palm, and had lines crossing in patterns. I ran my fingertips over them, feeling the grooves. That was my first sign something was off. I tried to look them up in old documents the church gave me. They had official drawings, records of past renovations, and some structural details. but no mention of those carvings. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe someone snuck up here in the past and did some vandalism. But the patterns were too well made for casual graffiti. I felt a weird tension in my chest when I studied them, almost like they were staring back at me. I moved on with my job, though. I replaced a few corroded nails, sanded a test area, and then hammered new bracings into place. After a couple of hours, I heard something odd. It was late, around midnight. I thought maybe it was a draft blowing through cracks, but it sounded like chains dragging across a rough surface. I stopped hammering and listened. The noise came from above me, but the area was sealed. There was no ladder to the next level. I shined my flashlight around, but everything was still. The caretaker had told me the bell overhead was locked in place and there were no visible chains left in the tower. I stood there waiting. The noise stopped. I shook my head and went back to work. A few nights passed and I got used to small quirks. Things sometimes felt out of place and my lamp flickered more than I liked. But I was making progress. One night I took a short break to step outside for some fresh air. When I came back in, my chisel was on the floor and my tape measure was rolled out, trailing across the boards. I stood there confused. I knew I left everything on my table. I have a habit of setting my tools neatly to avoid tripping on them in low light. But there they were, scattered. At first I thought maybe the caretaker came by or a draft knocked them down, but the tape measure was pulled out a good 6 feet, which didn't make sense if it had just fallen. I started to get this tight feeling in my stomach whenever I climbed those stairs. My breathing would get shallow. I'd pause at each landing, expecting to see someone or something. I never did see anything in those moments, but the air felt heavy. I wanted to push through because I take pride in my work. I don't like leaving a job undone. I tried not to let my nerves get to me. One night I saw a figure. It was just a shape at first, a dark outline near the far side of the tower's interior. I glanced up from a beam I was sanding and caught a glimpse. It seemed to be watching me. I called out, "Who's there?" No response. I walked over, but as I got close, I smelled something burnt, like scorched wood. Then it was gone. The figure wasn't there anymore. I stood with my flashlight searching the corners, but nothing moved. I told myself it was a trick of the light. But my skin prickled and my heart thudded in my chest. The next evening, I examined the carved symbols again. They looked deeper, like someone had taken a knife and traced over them in the last day or two. I ran my thumb over one carving and felt fresh edges in the wood. I looked around for footprints, but the dust was disturbed everywhere anyway from my own steps and the work. I found no clear prints. It was strange enough that I decided to talk to the caretaker the next day. He shrugged, said something about how the tower had a history and that maybe I should just focus on repairs. He didn't offer any details. I got the feeling he knew more but didn't want to share. I kept working. The dragging chain noise came back on a Thursday night right after I stepped onto the upper landing. This time it was louder, and I felt the vibration under my boots. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I banged on a column trying to see if there was any metal piece inside. The sound stopped. I stood still, listening to my own heartbeat. Then I thought I heard a slow rasp, like someone exhaling. My pulse hammered in my ears. I clutched my flashlight, aimed it at every corner, then slowly made my way back to my table. Everything was where I left it, which was almost reassuring, but I still felt uneasy. A couple of hours later, I talked to the tower's wood. I do that sometimes when I'm alone. I'll say things like, "Let's see how bad you are," or "We'll get you patched up." That night I said, "Are you hiding something from me?" Half joking, half trying to calm myself. The wood creaked right after I spoke, like it was answering. It wasn't just a random squeak. It sounded timed to my words right when I finished. I stood there with my arms tense, waiting for another noise. Nothing else happened, so I tried to push it aside, but I couldn't shake that weird sense that the tower was responding. I stepped away to organize my toolbox. When I came back, the newly sanded area had sawdust spread across it in a pattern I didn't recognize. It looked like lines and circles. I ran my hand over it to clear it off, and I noticed the beam felt warm, which didn't make sense. My lamp wasn't that close to it, and the night air was cold. I shook my hand, then held my palm against the wood again, feeling that warmth. Then it cooled off quickly as if the heat just vanished. The tension built each night. I started to look over my shoulder every time I picked up a hammer or a chisel. My heart would race whenever I had to climb up the steps. I forced myself to keep going because the church was paying well, and I had a job to finish. But I began to dread each evening. The chain noises happened more often, and sometimes I heard a distant thumping, like footsteps in another part of the tower. But there wasn't another part. It was just beams, columns, and a locked bell platform overhead. One night, around 2 a.m, I saw that figure again. It was clearer this time, like a shape made of dark, shifting smoke. It wore something like a hood. I couldn't see a face. It was just there, standing near the far column, watching me. My throat tightened and sweat beaded on my forehead. I wanted to run, but I stood frozen. My muscles felt stiff. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The figure drifted backward, almost sliding across the floor without moving its legs. Then it vanished through the wall. I dropped my hammer in shock. The clang echoed in the tower. After that, I decided to speed up my work. I replaced beams faster than I'd planned, even if it meant risking sloppy craftsmanship. But I couldn't stomach the idea of staying there longer than I had to. Every night I'd hear those chains or that rasping breath. Sometimes I'd see glimpses of that hooded shape in the corners of my vision. My hands would shake when I tried to drill or hammer. My throat felt dry. My eyes kept darting around, trying to catch it before it disappeared. The tower felt alive. The wood would groan at odd moments, and it often happened right after I said something out loud. It was like the place wanted me to know it could hear me. I started speaking less, keeping my thoughts to myself. But the tension got worse. My temples pounded with a dull ache, and I couldn't focus. My palms were clammy. Every creak set my heart racing. I found fresh carvings one night. They matched the older symbols but were etched more crudely, like someone had rushed. They were on a beam I'd replaced the night before. That wasn't possible because I'd just installed it, and I knew it had a smooth surface with no markings. I had trouble breathing when I realized that. I stood there, running my fingers over the new grooves, feeling the raw edges. The next moment, I heard the dragging chains from directly behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but saw nothing. Then I felt a cold presence near my shoulder. My hair stood on end. I felt like something was breathing down my neck. I staggered forward, nearly tripped over my tool bag, and the feeling vanished. I tried to talk to the caretaker again, but he avoided me. He acted like he was too busy to chat, always glancing at the ground, refusing to make eye contact. I finally cornered him by the church entrance one afternoon, asked him straight out if he'd seen anything in the tower. He just said, "You're the one who agreed to do this at night. Maybe you shouldn't." Then he walked away. That was the last real conversation we had. I pressed on. My body felt stiff, and I woke up every day with sore muscles from all the tension. I started wearing headphones some nights, blasting music to block out the silence, but it only made the sudden chain noises more jarring. One moment I'd hear nothing but my music. Then I'd catch a loud scraping sound in the background, and my heart would jump. I'd rip off the headphones, stare around in panic, then see nothing. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the darkness, but my flashlight revealed bare columns and old boards. One evening, I decided to keep every tool locked in a chest. That way, if something moved them, I'd know. Around midnight, I left for a quick break. When I came back, I found my tool chest wide open, not forced, just unlocked. My drill and nails lay scattered, and a handful of nails formed a circle on the floor. My chest tightened at the sight. I knew I locked that chest. I double-checked before leaving. My heart raced and sweat trickled down my sides. I picked up the nails, tossed them back in, and locked the chest again. I felt like I was losing it. Near the end of the job, I was close to finishing the main supports. I started bolting a final brace across 2 beams. The tower was quieter than usual that night, with no footsteps or chains. I actually felt a bit calmer. Then at around 1 a.m, the figure appeared a few feet from me, closer than it had ever been. I saw the smoky outline of its hood. My chest tightened, and my arms felt shaky. My breath came in gasps. The figure didn't speak or move, just hovered there. I felt like I was on the verge of passing out. I dropped my wrench. It hit the floor with a loud clang. The figure slowly raised what might have been an arm, pointed at the symbols on the beam, and then its form rippled. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my toolbox. The figure dissolved into thin air. I couldn't take it anymore. I finished the brace in a hurry, my hands shaking so much I dropped a few bolts. I hammered the last nails as fast as I could, sweat pouring down my face. Every sound made me flinch. The wood squeaked a few times like it was trying to talk to me. I ignored it. I just wanted out of there. After I packed my tools, I took one final look at the carvings. They sat there, silent and ominous. My flashlight beam trembled over them. Then I heard a single metallic scrape from above, and a gust of cold air swept across my face. I rushed down the spiral stairs, gripping the handrail so hard my knuckles hurt. I wanted to tell the caretaker I was done, but he wasn't around. I left him a note saying the tower was stable and the wood was replaced. I never went back at night. Sometimes I pass by that church during the day and glance at the tower. It's quiet in the sunlight, but I remember the noises, the carvings, and that hooded shape. I still feel a clench in my gut thinking about it. I don't have answers for what I saw or heard. All I know is I did my job, and I got the hell out of there. That place has its own guardian, and I don't plan on meeting it again. I first heard about the locked room on my second day at the Grand Haven Hotel. I had already finished inspecting most of the suites, ballrooms, and conference areas. Everything looked decent on the surface. The carpets were thick and red, the paintings on the walls were old but well maintained, and the staff seemed serious about upkeep. Yet there was a constant buzz among the employees about a room on the top floor that was never rented out. Rumors said it was haunted or cursed. People whispered about strange noises. I usually don't believe in that kind of talk, but I was too curious to ignore it. My job is to sign off on every space. If there's a room that's been overlooked, I want to know why. I didn't care about ghost stories. I cared about compliance. When I asked the front desk manager about it, she didn't say much. She only said the room was out of service because of structural issues. No one had done any major work there in years. That made no sense to me. This hotel was proud of its restoration efforts, so a room left to rot seemed out of place. I decided I would check it myself. I had a master key that let me into every door, so no one could stop me. I waited until later in the evening, around dinner time, so the hallways were less busy. Then I rode the old elevator to the top floor. The corridor there was quiet and felt a bit colder than the lower floors. At the far end, I saw a single door with a small brass number plate. It had a layer of dust around the edges. Most of the doors in the hotel looked polished and neat. This one looked neglected. I tried the knob, but it was locked. I pulled out my set of keys. The metal clinked against the door as I slipped the master key inside. The door clicked open. A musty smell hit me first, but underneath it, I noticed something sweet, like a perfume that had gone stale. My eyes stung. It wasn't so bad that I had to stop breathing, but it stuck in the back of my throat. I flipped the light switch and a single overhead fixture turned on, flickering for a moment. The first thing I noticed was the wallpaper. It was peeling at the corners and it had a pattern of faded vines. Some parts had small tears. The carpet in there was damp in some spots. I couldn't figure out the source of the moisture because the windows were all sealed. 2 windows, both locked shut. No sign of cracks or leaks. As I took a few steps inside, I felt a breeze brush against my face, but I didn't see any vent or fan. It was strange because the air felt like it was circulating, though nothing appeared to be switched on. I made a quick scan. The bed stood against the far wall with a plain headboard. The sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in a very long time. A thick layer of dust lay on top, and some parts had that same dampness. There was a small writing desk near the window. with an old chair that had rips in the upholstery. A mirror sat above a dresser on the opposite wall. I noticed a faint humming, like an electric buzz, but I couldn't locate where it was coming from. I didn't see any faulty wiring or exposed cables. My flashlight revealed nothing out of place except for old furniture and dust. I walked over to the dresser. I tested the drawers to see if they opened or if they were damaged. The top drawer got stuck halfway, so I had to tug at it. Inside, I found a couple of old doilies and a crumpled piece of paper. It looked like an unfinished letter. The writing was smudged. I could only make out a few words. Can't stay. Hear it. And something about moving on its own. The rest was illegible. I felt a chill on my neck. The temperature dropped suddenly. I put my hand on the back of my neck and noticed goosebumps. I heard a creak coming from the corner of the ceiling. I lifted my flashlight to see if there was something up there, but I only saw a spot where the ceiling paint was cracked. I decided to check the bathroom. I didn't expect anything unusual. It was a typical old-style bathroom with a clawfoot tub, a sink, and a mirror above it. There was a stale smell, like damp towels left out too long. I turned the faucet to see if the water was running. The pipes groaned and a bit of rusty water came out, then cleared. The mirror fogged up, which I found odd since the water wasn't that hot. I reached up to wipe it with my hand. I froze when I saw letters forming on the glass. It looked like someone was writing from the other side of the mirror. It spelled out, "Why are you here?" I felt my stomach tighten. My mind raced, trying to find a logical reason for this. I figured maybe there was some trick with the glass, or maybe I was seeing shapes in the fog, but it was too clear. I blinked a few times. The letters stayed there. Then they slowly faded. I tried to see if there was a hidden mechanism behind the mirror. I even pried at the edges to see if it was loose. It was firmly attached. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt sweat building on my forehead. I told myself to remain calm. I stepped back into the bedroom. That breeze hit me again. The light overhead flickered once more. This time I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. The chair at the writing desk had shifted a bit, as if someone had bumped it. I stood still, waiting to see if it would move again. After a few seconds, it tilted slightly. I heard a soft scraping sound from the legs rubbing against the floor. My throat went dry. I felt my palms sweating. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone to document this. I snapped a couple of pictures, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary in the images. The chair looked like any old piece of furniture. I tried to steady my nerves. My job is to evaluate safety, so I planned to check the walls and see if there was some vibration or draft. I tapped the walls to see if they were hollow or had some hidden door. Each spot I tapped gave off a dull thud, except one section near the closet. That area gave a faint echo, as if there was space behind it. I pulled the closet door open. I saw a bare rod for hanging clothes and a few old hangers. The walls inside looked normal. I moved the hangers aside to see if there was a crack or some panel. I felt a small draft on my hand, but I couldn't find any opening. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping noise. It sounded like gentle knocks coming from behind the wallpaper. I froze, listening. The rhythm wasn't consistent. It felt like it was responding to my presence. When I stepped away, it quieted. When I moved closer, it picked up again. I tried pressing my ear to the wall, but the tapping stopped altogether. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up again. My heart thumped so hard I heard blood rushing in my ears. I moved back to the bedroom area and pointed my flashlight under the bed. There were a few dusty boxes and a suitcase. I decided to pull them out. The suitcase was locked, and I didn't have the combination. The boxes were filled with old hotel brochures and menu cards from decades ago. Nothing seemed strange about them. At that moment, I heard a sharp click behind me. I stood up and saw the door to the hallway had closed on its own. I walked over and tried the knob. It turned fine, but when I pulled on it, the door felt stuck. I jiggled it harder, and then it opened. The corridor outside was empty and silent. I stepped out for a second, took a breath, then decided I wasn't finished. I wanted to check the room thoroughly. I walked back in and closed the door behind me, leaving it slightly ajar so it wouldn't lock itself. I turned back toward the bed. That sweet smell got stronger, like cheap perfume. I coughed and rubbed my eyes. The overhead light flickered again, more intensely. The air turned warm for a moment, then dropped to a chill. My hands were shaking a bit. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. I walked around the bed to get to the dresser mirror again. I looked at my reflection. My face looked pale, and my hair was a bit messy from running my hands through it. The mirror started to fog again, this time without any obvious heat source. I stepped closer. Letters formed once more. "Help," it spelled. My breath caught in my throat. The letters looked shaky, as if someone was writing with trembling fingers. I leaned in and whispered, "What do you want?" My voice cracked a bit. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then the fog faded. The word disappeared. I tried not to panic, but I felt my heart racing. I heard the tapping on the walls again, this time more urgent, like a low thump-thump, almost in sync with my heartbeat. My body tensed up, my teeth clenched. I took a few steps forward and placed my palm on the wall. It felt like a gentle vibration was pulsing beneath the wallpaper. I felt a light throb against my hand. It was like the wall had a faint heartbeat. My mind screamed that this was impossible. Buildings don't have pulses. I thought maybe it was some old pipe or air duct. But it felt different. It seemed to react to my movements. When I pressed harder, the vibrations got faster. When I pulled my hand away, they slowed. I turned around, half expecting to see something behind me. The room looked the same, except the chair at the desk was now facing me. It had been facing the desk before. I was sure of it. My pulse thudded in my ears. I approached the chair, leaned down, and touched its armrest. The fabric felt damp. I smelled that same sweet odor, stronger now. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I backed up a few steps and glanced around, searching for any sign of an actual person. Nothing. I pulled. I stood outside the old concert hall and felt my palms sweat. The front doors were covered in plywood, and the windows looked stained and cracked. I noticed a chain around the door handles, but the lock was already cut. I pushed the door open and walked in. My footsteps echoed through the lobby, and I heard a faint drip in the distance. The air smelled stale. Pieces of plaster were on the floor near the walls, and I saw watermarks on the ceiling. I thought about turning around and leaving, but I had a job to do. A friend of mine wanted me to check an abandoned piano and see if it could be restored. I was a pianist before my accident, and I still played whenever I could. I wasn't sure why they thought I was the right person, but they trusted my judgment, so I agreed. I walked deeper into the building. My shoes left tracks in the dust. My ears buzzed like they sometimes did after the accident, and I rubbed them to clear my head. There was a large set of doors on the left and a smaller door on the right. I tried the smaller door first, and it was locked. I tried the large doors. They opened with a loud creak. That led me to the main hall. The seats were torn, and the carpet smelled of mold. I stepped onto the wooden floor in front of the seats, heading toward the stage. My breath sounded louder than usual. I noticed the overhead lights were broken. The only light came from a few small windows near the ceiling. Dust floated in those weak beams. I checked the stage for any signs of damage, and I saw water dripping from the far corner. There was a large cloth in the center of the stage. It was stained and torn in places. I moved closer and spotted the shape of a piano underneath. I tried to lift the cloth, but it was heavier than I expected, and it smelled musty. I pulled it back. The piano was a grand piano, black paint chipped on the edges. The lid was closed and the legs looked sturdy, but the wood was dull. I stepped around it to get a better view. The stool was missing. I leaned against the piano and tested a few keys with my right hand. Most of them felt sticky. I pressed them harder, and they made a dull thud instead of a clean note. My partial hearing loss made it tricky to judge pitch at certain frequencies, but I could still sense a strange vibration from some of the keys. I walked around to the side and lifted the lid. The hinges creaked and some dust spilled inside. The strings were rusty, and one of the dampers looked warped. I pressed a few keys again, focusing on the ones in the lower range. A deep, off-key tone rattled through the hall. Then I heard something else. It sounded like a faint moan from the piano. I checked the strings. They all looked old and neglected, but the sound lingered longer than I expected. It wasn't a typical resonance. It felt like a distortion. I paused and wondered if my hearing was acting up. Sometimes I heard buzzing or echoes because of my condition. I tested a few more keys in the mid-range. 2 or 3 made that same moaning sound. I pressed them again. This time, it felt like something pushed back. My finger jerked away. I stepped back from the piano. My heart pounded. I reminded myself that old pianos sometimes had mechanical quirks. The wood might have swelled or the felts could be stuck. I took a deep breath and decided to take some notes. I pulled out my phone to record a voice memo. I spoke quietly, describing the condition of the piano, the strings, the keys, and the frame. Then I pressed some keys again, hoping to capture the sound. When I played the same notes, they sounded normal for a moment, but then I heard faint static in my recording. The moan was there, but it was softer. I felt my pulse speed up, and I realized my mouth was dry. I tried to calm down by looking around the stage. The curtains were torn, with dark stains along the bottom. There were holes in the ceiling where water leaked in. A few random chairs were pushed to the side, legs cracked or bent. I checked the stage floor for any signs of serious damage, but I only saw a few warped boards near the corner. I stepped toward one of the walls and tapped it. It sounded hollow, but it didn't look ready to collapse. I turned back to the piano, trying to focus on my job. I decided to test more of the keyboard. I walked back and stood where a stool should have been. I flexed my fingers and placed them on the keys. My left ear still felt a bit muffled, but I could hear enough to piece together a short melody. I played something simple. The notes were uneven. Some stuck, some sounded weak. After a while, I heard more than just my own playing. I heard a chord progression rising behind my notes like a distant echo. I lifted my hands, but the chord continued. I froze. My legs felt weak. The chord faded, and I listened hard. I realized the chord was coming from the piano, but I wasn't pressing any keys. My chest got tight and my hands shook. I wanted to run, but something kept me there. I pressed a single note, a middle C. I held it for a second. Then I released it, and I heard a short sequence of notes follow like a response. I stepped back and stared at the keys. I heard my own breathing, shallow and uneven. I glanced around the hall, expecting to see someone else. There was no one. I thought maybe a window was open and some wind was hitting the strings. I walked around the piano, checking for a draft. The windows were all sealed, even if they were cracked. No breeze. I turned back to the piano, reached out and pushed a random black key. The same sort of echo came back like a quiet chord. I felt dizzy. I gripped the side of the piano. I wanted to explain it logically, but my mind was blank. I reminded myself I had a job to do. I tried to push aside the fear. The piano was obviously in bad shape. I knew it would need a full restoration. New strings, new hammers, new dampers, refinishing, the works. I opened the lid completely and looked inside. The frame had a layer of dust, but it wasn't cracked. That was good. The frame was crucial. I felt relieved. At least the piano had a chance of being restored. I closed the lid slowly and pulled the cloth back over the top, leaving part of the keyboard exposed. I decided to come back later with better tools and possibly another person to help me. I grabbed my phone and made a note of what parts I thought were salvageable. The hall started to feel colder. I heard a soft creak near the backstage area. I glanced over. There was a dark corridor that led to the dressing rooms and storage rooms. I thought I saw a flicker of light move across the wall. I tried to breathe normally, but my heart was still racing. I felt sweat on my forehead. I told myself it was my imagination. Then I heard footsteps. They sounded light but quick. They moved away from me. I followed them without thinking. I wanted to confirm I wasn't alone. I walked backstage, stepping over fallen debris. One of the overhead light fixtures dangled by a single wire, swaying as I passed. The corridor smelled damp, and the walls had peeling paint. The footsteps echoed around me, then stopped. I reached a door marked storage. I tried it. It was unlocked. I peeked inside. Darkness. I shone my phone's flashlight into the room. I saw crates, boxes, some old stage props, and a few stands. Nothing moved. There was no person in there. I backed out and closed the door. The corridor turned left and led to another room, but the door there was blocked by a collapsed section of the ceiling. I couldn't get through, so I returned to the stage. I heard a faint rustling sound. My eyes jumped to the piano. There was a thin layer of mist around it, like a low fog. I noticed it swirling near the legs of the piano. My stomach lurched. I had never seen anything like that. I took a few steps closer, and the mist faded. I knelt down, touched the stage floor, and felt it was damp. I stood again and watched the piano. The cloth moved slightly, as if someone tugged it. I felt goosebumps on my arms. My breathing got faster. I approached the piano and placed my hand on the cloth. It felt cold. I pulled the cloth away again. The keyboard looked the same, except there was a slight reflection, like a sheen of moisture on some keys. I stared, unsure what to do. Then I heard a gentle tapping sound behind me. It reminded me of someone tapping a baton on a stand like a conductor. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around. No one was there, but the tapping continued. My heart pounded. Then it stopped abruptly. I turned back to the piano, and I saw something on the floor, near the pedals. It was a faint outline of a figure. I only saw it for a second. My eyes felt strained, and my ear buzzed again. I blinked. The figure was gone. I placed my hand on the piano to steady myself. Then the piano made a loud, dissonant chord. I jumped back and almost fell. The chord rang out through the hall, echoing off the walls. My ears rang. My chest felt tight. I coughed to clear my throat. I thought about running out the door, but instead I pressed my palms together and tried to calm down. I wanted to see if it would happen again. I approached the piano. I set my hands on the keyboard and pressed a quiet chord, just a simple triad. The piano responded with a short, shrill cluster of notes. I froze. My fingers were off the keys, but the sound continued. Then it faded. I took a step back. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to reason it out again. Maybe there was an old mechanical system in the building or some wiring interference. I had no real explanation, but I was desperate for one. My phone's battery was getting low, so I decided to leave. I needed more time to think, and I wanted to come back with better lighting and maybe a colleague. I glanced around the stage one last time, listening to the steady drip of water from the ceiling. The piano was silent. The mist was gone. The cloth lay on the floor, bunched up by the piano's side. I stared at it, feeling uneasy. I left the stage and headed toward the exit. My throat felt tight. I forced myself to keep walking. When I reached the doors, I heard a sudden swell of notes from behind me. I paused and turned. The music was faint but distinct. It was a fast, urgent passage like something from an intense symphony. I couldn't see the piano from this angle, but I knew the sound came from the stage. My breath caught in my chest. I felt my shoulders tense. The music stopped as quickly as it started, and the hall went silent. I pushed the lobby doors open. The evening light outside looked brighter than normal, probably because I had been in that dark building so long. I exhaled as I stepped onto the sidewalk. My hands were clammy, and my legs felt shaky. I closed the door behind me, even though it wouldn't lock. I turned and stared at the concert hall's facade. The broken windows and boarded doors gave it a grim appearance. I tried to make sense of what I heard and saw. Nothing seemed logical. I knew old structures had odd acoustics, and my hearing issues sometimes tricked me, but I didn't believe that explained everything. I took a few minutes to compose myself. Then I headed down the street, away from the hall. I told myself I would come back soon with equipment and see if there was a physical cause for those sounds and that mist. But I couldn't get the memory of those chords out of my mind. The piano felt alive in some strange way, like it was reacting to me. I wanted to prove it wasn't supernatural. I also felt a strange urge to play it again, to test the notes more thoroughly, even though it scared me. On my way home, I kept rubbing my ears, waiting for the buzzing to stop. My accident had taken away some of my hearing, but it hadn't stopped me from loving the piano. Now I was worried this particular piano had more problems than just rusted strings and sticky keys. I wanted to fix it if I could, but I didn't know if I had the courage to keep trying. The memory of that echoing chord still made my hands tremble. Yet a part of me was curious. I thought about how the piano responded to my simple triad with a sudden burst of dissonant notes. It felt like the piano was communicating. I got to my apartment, locked the door, and sat on my couch. My heart rate was still elevated. I drank some water and replayed the voice memo I'd recorded earlier. I listened for the strange moaning sound. The recording hissed with static. The keys sounded faint and the moan was barely audible, but it was there. I frowned. My phone battery died before I could analyze it further. I set the phone aside, closed my eyes and tried to relax, but my thoughts circled around that dark hall and that worn-out piano. I felt a pull to return, and I knew I would. I just didn't know how I'd handle it when I got there. I felt something was off the moment I stepped into the main hall that night. I stood by the front desk, checking my list of new arrivals, and my ears picked up a faint clicking sound. It came from the far end of the corridor, near the gallery dedicated to artifacts from lost civilizations. I couldn't see anyone, but I heard the noise, like someone tapping shoes against stone. The museum was closed to the public. All staff had left, and security was on a skeleton crew. I thought maybe a guard was making rounds. I called out, "Anybody there?" No answer. The tapping stopped. I've been a curator for years. My name is David, and I handle exhibits on ancient cultures, mostly focusing on lesser-known practices. I prefer everything in place. Paintings hung at exactly the right height, descriptive plaques lined up perfectly, lighting adjusted to precise levels. I don't like messy routines. I like a clear plan, with no surprises. That night, I was verifying the new shipment of paintings for our Forgotten Rituals exhibition. My job was to ensure each piece was accounted for and in good condition. I made notes and studied the frames for any signs of damage. The paintings all depicted strange ceremonies, robed figures, and dimly lit fires. I recognized none of the artists. The brushstrokes looked rough, like the painter was in a hurry or unsettled. Some corners of the canvas showed blurry forms that might have been chanting figures, but the details weren't clear. The second I unboxed one particular painting, I felt uneasy. It showed a landscape with a cloudy sky and a distant group of silhouettes. They wore cloaks and their faces were hidden by shadows. In the middle stood a tall figure with arms raised, as though leading some chant. The label on the crate just read, "Night Gathering." I didn't like the colors in that piece. Everything had a muddy look, and the horizon seemed to shift if I stared too long. I wrote a note in my log. Painting 13, unusual effect on observer. I told myself I was just tired. I hung that painting on the assigned wall in the new ritual section. It was about 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, bigger than most pieces in the show. The glass panel in front of it wasn't standard. It came with the piece, supposedly for preservation reasons. The edges had odd symbols etched into them, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. I just wanted the painting up so I could finish. I remember stepping back to check the alignment, and in that moment, I thought I saw a shadow flicker across the sky in the picture. I leaned in, adjusting my glasses. Nothing changed, but my stomach felt tense. I told myself the overhead spotlights were playing tricks. After I hung the last painting and locked up, I headed to my office. It's a small room near the back with a desk, a computer, and cabinets. I keep reference books and catalogs there. I sat down to fill in some final paperwork. The overhead light flickered, something that happened a lot in that old wing. I noted the flicker, glanced up, then heard a shuffle outside my door. The museum should have been empty. Security does a sweep every hour, but they normally announce themselves or pass by quietly. This was a slow, scraping shuffle. I froze, pen in hand. For a second, I thought maybe it was the wind or a janitor, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I stood, stepped to the door, and opened it. The corridor lights were dim. I saw no one. I stood there, listening. The shuffle came again from the far end. I decided to check. I walked carefully, scanning the floor and the corners. The corridor leads to several galleries. The walls are lined with older paintings, each behind protective glass. At that hour, the shadows seemed to expand, distorting everything. I reached the place where the corridor splits into two directions. To the left, there's the exit. To the right, there's a larger display area. That's when I saw the wet footprints. They looked like footprints from bare feet, a single trail going across the marble floor. The prints were faint, but they glistened under the overhead light. They led to the right, toward the paintings of the new exhibit. I paused and wondered if a pipe had burst, but the shape of those prints looked too defined for a leak. I followed them, feeling my heart beat faster. They seemed to go right up to a wall. There they just ended. No door, no window, no sign that anyone had turned around. It looked as if someone had walked straight into the wall. I reached out and touched the spot. The wallpaper felt cold, like stone in winter. I knocked lightly. Solid. I stepped back. The footprints were real. My shoes squeaked in a small puddle. My palms were sweating. I turned to look around, expecting to see a person hiding. I saw only paintings in protective cases. I decided to check the security office. Maybe the guard on duty had an explanation. I walked back through the corridor, heading toward the main lobby. The place felt too quiet. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the walls. When I reached the security office, I found the door locked and no one inside. The lights were off. I tapped on the glass window. No response. That was unusual. Usually, someone monitors the cameras from there. I peered through the window. The monitors were on, but I couldn't see the guard. I wanted to use my phone, but the battery was dead because I'd been on calls all day with suppliers. I couldn't contact anyone. I felt a chill. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but I was concerned. I walked back toward the new exhibit, thinking maybe the guard was patrolling there. As I approached, I heard that same shuffling sound. It was close, somewhere in the shadows behind the columns. I called out, "Show yourself." My voice echoed. I got no response. The lights flickered. Then I heard a whisper of my name. David. It came from the direction of the large painting I had hung earlier. I know the acoustics in the museum can do weird things, but it sounded like a real voice. I walked faster, ignoring the pounding in my chest. When I reached the painting called Night Gathering, I stopped. The corridor lights had dimmed near it. The painting was partly lit by a flickering bulb overhead. My eyes went to the figures in the painting. I wanted to confirm they looked the same. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The robed silhouettes were still there. The tall figure in the center still had its arms raised. But I noticed something. The horizon in the background had a faint glow, like a distant flicker. I leaned in, pressing my face close to the glass. I saw movement in the clouds. It was subtle but real, like a breeze passing through them. My stomach tightened, and I felt short of breath. I told myself I was just seeing things. I decided to walk away, but as I turned, I heard the sound of soft tapping against glass. It was coming from inside the frame of the painting. My throat went dry. I approached again. I thought I saw a shadow in one of the corners, shifting left to right like someone pacing. I banged on the protective glass with my fist. I shouted, "Stop it!" It was a reflex. I didn't expect an answer. The glass rattled, then the tapping stopped. The corridor lights came back on at full brightness. Everything was still. I felt stupid for yelling at a painting, so I forced myself to breathe and stepped back. I needed a moment to think. I decided to go to the break room, which is around the corner. I wanted water. I found a bottle in the fridge and took a big gulp. It tasted stale, but it helped. I paced around the small tables and chairs, pressing my palms against my temples. I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe the security guard was messing with me. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight. Then I heard a noise in the hallway outside the break room. A whisper, not quite clear, but it sounded like multiple voices chanting. I cracked the door open and listened. The voices echoed as if they traveled through a long tunnel. I decided to follow the sound. I gripped the doorknob so hard my hand hurt. I walked back into the corridor. The chanting grew louder when I passed certain paintings that depicted old ceremonies. One painting showed a group dancing around a ring of stones. I paused in front of it. My ears picked up muffled drumming. I pressed my ear to the glass, trying to isolate the sound. It was there, faint, repeating in a loop. When I moved away, the drumming stopped. My heart pounded. I noticed fresh footprints on the floor again. The same shape, bare feet, wet tracks. They led around a corner toward another section of the exhibit. I followed them. My legs felt shaky. The chanting seemed to come from all sides now, but at a low volume, like a constant murmur. The footprints ended at another painting. It was smaller, showing two figures in hooded robes standing near a stone altar. Their faces were turned away, so I only saw the edges of their hoods. I heard breathing. It was soft but close, like a person standing next to me. I whipped around. Nobody was there. My skin prickled. I reached out and touched the protective glass. It felt cold and slightly wet, as if someone had sprayed it with a fine mist. I wiped my hand on my pants. I felt uneasy and decided to step back to the main hall. Suddenly, the lights in the entire wing went out. Total darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a weak glow. I froze in place. The chanting voices grew louder in the darkness. They echoed down the corridor, and my name surfaced among them. "David," they whispered, sometimes softly, sometimes in a drawn-out tone. I wiped sweat from my forehead and reached for the wall, trying to find my way. My fingertips bumped against a display case. I made my way toward the main lobby, which has windows that face the street. I knew if I could get to the front, I'd see some light from outside. As I neared the lobby, the chanting began to fade, replaced by a constant whispering that I couldn't decipher. It reminded me of air escaping from a cracked pipe, but it formed syllables. I tried not to listen too closely. Then I saw a figure in the corner of the lobby. It wore something dark, like a cloak. I called out, "Hello?" The figure turned slightly, but I couldn't see a face. My stomach tightened. I took a slow step forward, and the figure stepped backward, blending into the shadows near a tall statue. When I reached that spot, there was nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears. I felt sticky sweat on my back. I looked outside and saw that the street was empty. The security shutters were down, so I couldn't just leave. I knew the side door might be locked from the inside, and I needed keys. My set of keys was in my office. I decided that was my next move. I turned around, heading back into the museum. The flickering emergency lights gave everything a strange glow. My footsteps echoed. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it came out ragged. I passed a room filled with old statues of animals. The glass eyes of those statues seemed to watch me. I made myself ignore it. Then I heard a dragging sound from behind one of the sculptures. I looked and saw nothing moving. I hurried on, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. After a short walk, I reached my office. The door stood open, even though I remembered closing it earlier. Inside, the overhead light was off, so the room was dim. My desk lamp was on, but it flickered. I approached my desk looking for my keys. They weren't where I usually keep them. I searched the drawers. Nothing. I felt frustration rise. Then from behind me, I heard a creaking noise. I spun around. The door was moving, inching closed. My body tensed, and I forced myself to grab it before it shut completely. I threw it open, hoping to catch whoever was on the other side. No one was there. I stepped back into the hallway. My breath came fast and my limbs felt weak. I had no keys, No phone. I needed to find a security guard or a way out. I decided to try the guard's route. The far end of the museum, where there's a small staircase leading to the basement security station. I made my way there, passing a row of paintings. Each painting displayed scenes of old rites, hooded figures, altars, and unfamiliar symbols. The chant in my head wouldn't go away, even though the halls were now silent. I reached the staircase. The door to the basement was ajar. A light shone from below. I took a few steps down. A strong smell of damp stone and dust hit me. The basement corridors are narrow, lined with pipes overhead. I heard a buzzing sound, like old fluorescent lights. I turned a corner and saw the security office at the end. The door was partly open. Light spilled out. I approached and peeked in. The monitors showed various halls and galleries. Most were dimly lit, but I caught movement on one of the screens. It was an empty corridor except for a single black shape drifting across the floor. It looked like a large shadow, but it moved independently of any figure. I blinked a few times, trying to make sense of it. I stepped inside the security office. The guard wasn't there. A half-eaten sandwich lay on the desk next to a cup of coffee. The coffee was cold. The computer was on, and the camera feeds kept cycling. I saw the new exhibit rooms. Some cameras flickered, showing static, then returning. I spotted the night gathering painting in one feed. The silhouettes in the painting seemed closer to the foreground than before, but I couldn't be sure. I looked away. My stomach clenched. On the desk, I found a ring of keys. I grabbed them, hoping one would open the side door. I needed to get out, or at least find a place with a working phone. I heard a sudden hiss from the hallway. I froze, keys clenched in my hand. The hiss faded into a whisper. I couldn't make out words, just a garbled sound. My skin felt clammy. I stepped out of the office and hurried back through the basement corridor. The lights flickered. My footsteps echoed. I reached the staircase and climbed it, holding the railing to steady myself. My body felt drained, but I kept going. When I emerged on the main floor, I headed straight for the side door. I reached it, tested the keys, and found the right one. It clicked and the door opened. A rush of night air hit my face. I stepped out into the alley behind the museum. I turned back to see if anything followed me. The corridor behind me was dark. I stood there, breathing heavily. My shirt clung to my back from sweat. No sign of shadows or footprints now. My mind was racing. I decided to lock the door behind me. Once I did, I felt a slight relief, but I could still hear that faint chanting in my ears, like an echo that wouldn't go away. My heart was still pounding, and I felt a tremor in my hands. I looked at the museum's old stone walls. They seemed lifeless in the dim streetlight, but I didn't trust that appearance anymore. I told myself I would return during the day, with more people around. I needed to figure out what was happening with those paintings, but not alone and not at night. I stood there in the cool air, waiting to see if any guard or staff member appeared. No one did. The chanting in my mind slowly faded, replaced by the hum of distant traffic. I gripped the keys and walked away, leaving the museum behind for the night. My senses felt raw, and my thoughts were jumbled. But at least I was outside, away from whatever was moving around in there. I planned to come back with help, no matter how ridiculous my story would sound. I just knew I couldn't face those shifting shapes and whispering voices alone again. I haven't slept well for a long time. My nights are rough and my cabin feels cramped when I lie awake listening to the wind push through the trees outside. I keep hearing things. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy. Maybe I am. But something real is happening out there on the water and I can't ignore it anymore. My name is Patrick, and I live by a lake that sits away from everything else. I don't see many people unless I row across to the other side, and that's rare. I like my solitude, or at least I used to. Now I feel like I'm never alone. Every night my skin tingles. My scalp gets tight. I feel eyes on me when I try to sleep. I hear the water shifting, the surface breaking, like something is swimming close to the shore. At first, I thought it was a large fish or maybe a beaver. Then I started to see strange markings on the mud. Deep grooves, like something with claws had crawled out and dragged itself back in. I started to stay up later. I would stand near my window and watch the shoreline, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever made those marks. I never see it directly. All I get are the noises and the impression of movement at the edges of my sight. Sometimes I go outside and hold my lantern over the water. The light isn't strong, and it reflects in a scattered way across the dark surface. The lake is calm most nights, but the reflection of the sky looks murky and twisted. I step closer. I lean in. I try to see my own face staring back. That's when I notice something is off. My reflection doesn't always match what I'm doing. I lift my hand. I wait for the reflection to lift its hand. There's a pause. It raises its hand a second later. That's not normal. It scares me, but I can't look away. When I see that delay, my stomach clenches. I feel cold sweat on my back. I check again. Maybe it's just the light or my exhaustion. But the second time it happened, I realized it was real. If I nod, the reflection stares back blankly for a moment before it nods. The worst part is the face itself. It looks like me, but somehow wrong. It's like the features are stretched, and the eyes are vacant, like glass marbles. That's the only way I can describe them. They have this dull shine, but no warmth. I tell myself not to touch the water. I don't want to feel it. Something about reaching down scares me. But 2 nights ago, I did it anyway. I squatted at the shoreline. I pressed my palm against the surface. The lake water felt thick and cold. Then something like fingers wrapped around my wrist and tried to pull me in. I yanked my arm back and fell on my side in the mud. I got up and cursed out loud. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. I held my lantern up again, but I saw nothing except the ripples in the water. My reflection was gone, or maybe it was just too dark. My hand stung at the place where those fingers grabbed me. I swear I felt them for a few seconds after I got back inside the cabin. I even saw a red outline on my wrist, like a burn or a bruise in the shape of a handprint. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I could have walked away from this place, but I've lived here too long. My family used to own this cabin. I fish to sustain myself and sell some of the catch to a local buyer who comes out once a week. It's simple, and I don't need anything else. But I'm starting to question if that's worth the anxiety that's clawing at my mind. In the morning, I decided to examine the shore in daylight. The sun makes the lake water look ordinary. It's almost peaceful. I thought I might see footprints or something, but all I found were strange claw marks in the mud. They looked random at first, then I followed a line of them near a large rock. They formed a trail going into the water, almost like something had crawled out, circled around, and then dragged itself back under. I stood there, trying to figure out if any known animal left those behind. A large cat? A bear with an odd gait? The spacing of the marks was unlike anything I'd seen. I spent the rest of that day on my small boat, trying to keep my mind occupied. The fish were biting, and I felt a sense of calm whenever I reeled one in. But at the back of my head, I kept thinking about the reflection. I reached over the side of the boat once, wanting to see my face in the water, but the ripples made it impossible to see clearly. I knew I'd have to face it again that night, though. When the sun went down, I tried to distract myself with some basic chores around the cabin. I cut firewood, cleaned my gear, and checked my lines. Then I sat down to eat. Every bite felt like I was forcing it down. I wasn't hungry. My appetite had shrunk over the last week. Sleep never came. I stayed in my chair, listening to every noise. The crickets were loud. The wind rustled through the tall grass. After a few hours, I heard a thump on the dock. It sounded like a wet slap. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside, my legs tense and my throat dry. I walked to the edge of the dock. The water was so still it looked like black glass. I crouched down, letting my lantern hang over the surface. I saw my reflection again, but it was blurred by the light's flicker. I leaned forward, My reflection's eyes stared back with that same empty look. I lifted my right hand, and my reflection did nothing for a moment. Then it lifted its right hand. I moved my left hand, and a few seconds later it moved its left. My gut twisted. That's when I heard something like a whisper. It was muffled, as if it came from behind a wall, but it was coming from the lake. It sounded like it was calling my name, dragging the syllables. I stiffened. I wanted to run back to the cabin, but I forced myself to stay a bit longer. Then, a sudden splash to my left made me jump. I turned the lantern. The surface rippled, and I caught a glimpse of something pale dipping under the water. My body locked up. I backed away, stepped on a loose board, and almost dropped the lantern. I rushed back inside, breathing hard, and locked the door. I sat on my small wooden chair, holding my head in my hands. My arms were shaking, and my eyes were burning from lack of sleep. I tried to rest, but I couldn't. Each time I closed my eyes, I pictured that distorted face looking back at me. Those eyes. That slow-motion imitation of everything I did. I was afraid to see what might appear if I went back out. But staying inside felt just as bad, because I could hear the water outside. It was like it was alive, calling out to me with every gentle lap on the shore. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up to a loud crash. It sounded like someone had slammed against the side of my cabin. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door a crack. Nothing was there, but I could hear the lake churning. I walked to the edge of the trees, close to where the shoreline curves. The water was moving in wide ripples. I saw those same claw marks. Some were fresh, carved deep into the mud. I followed them with the flashlight beam, feeling my stomach tighten as I saw them extend into the trees. Broken branches and bits of wet algae clung to the trunks. It was like something had dragged itself out and then circled back around. But I didn't see anything else. I decided to stay outside for a bit, to see if it would appear again. The darkness made my skin crawl, but I wanted answers. I walked along the shore, shining my flashlight onto the water. Nothing. Then I heard a low gurgling noise. It was coming from my left, near a big mossy boulder. I moved the beam. I saw a shape. It looked like my silhouette, but hunched and twisted, right at the edge where water meets land. I froze. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my neck. The shape slowly rose. I saw its eyes reflect the flashlight. They were milky, almost blank. I realized it had my face, but it was stretched and dripping with water. My hands went numb. I felt pins and needles in my arms. Then it slid back into the lake with a quiet splash, disappearing as if it was never there. I ran back to my cabin. My chest felt tight. I locked the door and checked the windows. I felt like the walls were closing in. I kept thinking about that thing wearing my face. My reflection was out there. It wasn't copying me from the lake anymore. It had come onto land. I paced around the cabin for hours. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to burst open. My mind felt raw, like I was stuck in a nightmare. But I knew it was real because my palms still had mud on them from the shoreline. When dawn broke, I forced myself to think logically. I collected some extra rope. I made sure my lanterns had enough oil. I thought if I could just see it clearly, maybe I could scare it off. So that afternoon, I rode around the perimeter of the lake. I looked at every inch of shore. I didn't see anything unusual except for more claw marks and a few dents in the mud that looked like knee prints. It made me shiver. I finished my circuit and returned to the dock. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I ate some dried fish. I tried to keep my focus, but my eyes kept drifting toward the water outside. Night came again, and I felt that tension in my chest. It was hard to breathe. My shirt clung to my back from sweat. I stepped outside, holding a lantern in one hand and a thick stick in the other. I went to the same spot by the dock. I knelt down. My reflection was there, but it looked normal this time. I raised my arm, and it raised its arm in unison. My heart rate slowed for a second. Maybe I had imagined the delay. Then I felt a freezing cold hand on my ankle. I jerked away, but it gripped me tight. I smashed my stick against the water, but it just made a heavy splash, soaking my pant leg. I pulled back until I fell onto my backside, the lantern swinging wildly. I saw a pale arm vanish below the surface, and then everything went quiet. My ankle stung with cold. My sock and boot were drenched. I scrambled back to the cabin, breathing fast and tasting metal in my mouth. Inside, I peeled off my wet clothes. My ankle had red streaks, like nail marks. I sat on the floor trying to calm down. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a haunting? A creature? Something else? I could still feel the cold pressure of that hand on my skin. The marks on my ankle were real. I didn't know who to call or how to explain it. Nobody from the town would believe me. They'd say I was sleep-deprived or making up stories. I spent another sleepless night hearing the occasional splash, listening to the timbers of my cabin creak with every shift of my weight. I tried to hold my breath and see if I could hear voices. Sometimes I did. They were faint, but they sounded like they were calling me by name, telling me to come outside to enter the water. My heart pounded every time. I had to fight the urge to open the door and look. When morning came, I noticed my boat had fresh scratches along the hull. They looked like claw marks again, long, thin gashes. The wood was chipped in places. I touched them with my fingertips, feeling how deep they were. A wave of nausea hit me. Something had crawled onto my boat during the night. I scanned the shoreline for footprints but saw nothing new. It was quiet and the lake looked normal under the sunlight. I decided to spend the day making repairs on the boat. Working with my hands helped keep me from losing my mind. At least the physical labor forced me to concentrate on something else. But as evening approached, I started to dread the moment the sun would sink behind the tree line. I stood by the water one last time before dusk, wondering if I should leave. Maybe I could walk out of here, find someplace else. But the thought of running from this place felt wrong, like I'd be letting it chase me forever. That night, I built a small fire pit on the shore. I wanted more light. I sat there with my lantern and the fire crackling. The heat on my face gave me some courage. I stared at the water. It was so still that the moon's reflection looked perfect, but I refused to look at my own reflection. I kept my eyes on the open water. Hours passed. I stoked the fire again and sparks flew upward. My back was getting stiff and my eyes felt gritty. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, trying to stay awake. Then I heard soft splashing. I gripped my lantern. Something was moving near the dock. I stood up, my muscles tense, and crept closer. I saw that pale shape again. It stood in ankle-deep water, facing me. The face was mine, but the skin was grayish, and the eyes were blank. Water dripped from its limbs. I wanted to shout, but my throat felt tight. I lifted the lantern, and it opened its mouth. No sound came out, but I heard a low, wet gurgle in my ears. It raised an arm, copying the movement I had done with the lantern. Then it took one step closer to shore. I could see water trickling from its fingers. My body trembled and my breath came in sharp bursts. It felt like every instinct told me to run, but I stayed. I saw the thing raise its other arm. My arms shook, but I kept the lantern pointed at it. I noticed the reflection in the water below it was out of sync, like a duplicate glitching behind. It was the same face repeated, both images twisted. I took a step back and it mirrored me, stepping forward. The delayed reflection in the lake was slower. Then the thing made a sudden move, reaching out toward me. I stumbled and dropped the lantern. The glass cracked, and the flames sputtered out. Darkness rushed in. I scrambled backward and my hand landed on a rock. I grabbed it and threw it at the shape. It hissed, or maybe the water hissed around it. I'm not sure. My mind was in overdrive. I heard a splash, and then it was gone. I sat there for what felt like a long time, staring at the dark water, my heart thudding in my ears. The fire behind me was dying down. I crawled back to it and fed some more wood into the embers, trying to get a bit of light. I checked my ankle again. The marks from the night before were still there, but no fresh ones. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wood steady. Now the sun is coming up. I'm writing this down with trembling hands. I don't know how many more nights I can take. I keep thinking about that warped reflection. It's out there, waiting. It wants me to go into the water. Every time I get close, it tries to grab me. I feel it in my cabin, in my dreams, even when I'm awake. I can't sleep. I can't eat without feeling sick. But I can't just leave my entire life behind either. That thing has my face. It moves like me, but slower. It's waiting for the right moment. Each time I think I've seen its worst form, it shows me something else. Sometimes I hear it trying to speak in my own voice, which is the most unsettling thing I've experienced. Tonight, I will stay near the shore again. I have more lantern oil, and I plan to keep a solid fire going. Maybe I'll try to catch it in the open and shine enough light on it. If I see a chance to attack it, I will. I just need to be careful not to get pulled in. If I feel those hands around my wrist again, I might not be able to break free, but I have no choice. I can't let that thing keep me hostage in my own home. I have to confront it, or it'll haunt me every night. My mind is frayed, and my body is worn down from fear, but I'll do whatever I must to stand my ground. I won't let the lake take me. Not now, not ever. I remember the first day I arrived in that small mountain town. The air felt heavy and the roads were winding. Old streetlights flickered even when the sun was out. People watched me from behind their windows. Their blinds shifted, and I saw the outlines of their faces. I got out of my car, stretched my legs, and looked around. I had come here to investigate a strange series of power outages that left whole neighborhoods in pitch-black darkness. I'm not a fan of remote places, but I was assigned to gather facts about these incidents. My name is Andrew, and I'm a journalist. I get nightmares sometimes, but nothing ever prepared me for what I experienced in those hills. I checked into a small lodge near the center of town. The reception area had this old wooden counter, squeaky floorboards, and a faint smell of damp fabric. The manager gave me a tired nod when I introduced myself. I tried to ask about the blackouts, but she avoided eye contact. All she said was, "Happens a lot. Be careful at night." I let out a long breath and took my key. My room had a single bed, a small table, and a lantern on the nightstand. The window faced the main street, which was empty most of the time. When I looked outside, I saw old shops with fading signs and a few people rushing home before dark. I could hear the rumble of a generator somewhere down the block. I set up my laptop, but the internet connection was weak, so I just typed notes in a document. My phone had only 1 bar of signal. I felt uneasy, but I tried to stay calm. Later that day, I decided to meet some locals. I walked down the street and stopped in front of a small cafe. The sign above the door was chipped, and the door creaked when I stepped in. A few people stood at the counter, ordering coffee. They glanced in my direction. I introduced myself to the barista, told her I was a journalist, and asked about the blackouts. She kept her voice low, looking around as if someone might overhear. She told me the outages never seemed to follow a pattern. "It can happen at noon or midnight," she said. "Whenever they come, everything just goes dark. No moonlight, no streetlights, nothing." She mentioned that some people had seen shadows moving in the darkness. "They say these shadows watch you," she added, her hand shaking. I could see a spark of fear in her eyes. I grabbed a coffee and took a seat by the window. I scribbled down everything she said. Then, an older man approached my table. He wore a thick jacket and had a small scar under his right eye. He pulled out a chair and sat without asking. He told me he heard I was looking for details about the blackouts. I nodded. He leaned closer and said, "Don't let the darkness catch you off guard. Always have a flashlight on you." I noticed his grip tighten on the edge of the table. I asked if he'd seen anything during these blackouts. He hesitated, then admitted, "I heard voices in the dark. They weren't mine. I don't know who they belonged to, but they whispered things I can't remember. And later, I forgot entire parts of my day." He stood up abruptly and left without another word. That same evening, I went back to the lodge and charged my phone, camera, and a small digital recorder. I had a flashlight with fresh batteries. Around 9 p.m., I heard a loud pop outside. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out. The entire building fell silent except for my own breathing. I turned on my flashlight and walked into the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest. The corridor was empty, lit only by my beam. I heard floorboards creaking from somewhere above me. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to focus on each step. I aimed the flashlight at the walls and the door frames. I didn't see anything out of place, but the air felt cold. I felt a slight pressure in my ears, like being underwater. A door down the hall slammed shut and my flashlight flickered. I paused, my pulse racing. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I could taste the dryness in my mouth. I raised the beam again and walked forward. My palms were sweaty. Then the flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I found myself in total darkness. In that split second, I thought I saw a shape at the end of the hall. It was taller than me, almost touching the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. Then the flashlight came back on and the corridor was empty. I exhaled hard, trying to keep steady. I headed back to my room, locked the door, and tried to record my thoughts on my digital recorder. My voice was shaky. I explained what I'd seen. After a few seconds, I realized I was repeating myself, like I forgot what I was doing. I stopped the recorder, rubbed my eyes, and pressed play to see if it captured anything strange. There was a faint static in the background, and I heard something that sounded like a second voice, deep and distorted. I felt my throat tighten and my stomach twisted. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely there. The lights came back after about 20 minutes. My body felt tense, like I'd been bracing for a punch. I tried to calm down by washing my face in the tiny bathroom sink. The reflection in the mirror looked normal, but I noticed my eyes seemed wider, and my face was pale. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right behind me in that hallway. The next day, I talked to a few more residents. They told me about how these blackouts started a few months ago. No one knew the exact cause. Some people thought it was old power lines in the mountains. Others believed there was something else at work. I heard a few stories about seeing figures in the darkness, but no one had concrete proof. I kept my eyes open, hoping to catch a photo or a recording if it happened again. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of town, where the old power station sat near a steep rock face. Rusty fences surrounded the site. A single guard stood by the gate, and he said the equipment was outdated but functional. He insisted that it never completely shut off on its own. I tried asking if they had any logs or data, but he refused to let me see anything. As I left, I heard a distant hum inside the station which rose and fell. It made my hair stand on end, but I couldn't explain why. Back in my room, I listened to the distorted audio from the night before. I isolated that strange voice on my laptop, boosting the volume. I still couldn't understand it. It sounded like a low growl. There was a slow vibration in it, like it was alive somehow. My head started to ache, and I had to take a break. I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The sun was getting low and the sky was turning a dull gray. I noticed the streetlights flickering again. I decided to follow some leads from the local newspaper archives. They had a small office near City Hall. The clerk there let me check old articles on microfilm. I sat in a cramped room, scanning headlines about minor crimes, accidents, and town events. There wasn't much about unexplained phenomena, but I found a brief mention of a strange outage several decades ago, with a note about sudden memory gaps among the residents. No one had a solid explanation. The article ended abruptly. There was a single mention of shadowy figures spotted during total darkness. That matched the stories I'd heard. My anxiety grew as I realized this had happened before. People either forgot about it or avoided talking about it. On my way back, I felt a heaviness in the air again. I glanced at the old streetlights, expecting them to go out any second. Then, it happened. Another blackout. Everything turned black. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. My heart hammered against my ribs. My ears rang. I heard a faint rustling, like someone was dragging feet across gravel. My breath hitched. I tried to move, but my legs felt numb. Then I felt something pass by me, cold against my arm. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight. Then I heard a whisper, right by my ear. It sounded like my own voice, but twisted and distant. When the lights flicked back on, I realized I was standing in the same spot, facing a wall. I couldn't remember turning around. My flashlight was in my hand, but it was switched off. My knees felt weak, and I had to lean on the wall for support. A headache throbbed behind my eyes. I felt like I lost a few minutes of my memory. I flicked the flashlight on and off. It worked fine now. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't keep a steady breath. I hurried back to the lodge. Once inside my room, I locked the door again. I turned on my recorder and described what happened. My voice sounded unsteady, and I kept pausing like I wasn't sure what to say. After I finished, I played it back. My segments of speech were clear, but in the background, I heard another voice. It sounded like me, but off. It repeated certain words I'd said, but slower and in a lower tone. I felt a chill spread through my chest. I grabbed the mirror from the dresser and looked at myself. My reflection was there, but I had this uneasy feeling like it was lagging. I moved my head from side to side. It matched my movements, but I couldn't shake the thought that it was studying me. I pressed my palm against my face, feeling sweat on my skin. When I moved my hand away, I thought I saw the reflection smile for a fraction of a second, even though my mouth was closed. I almost dropped the mirror. I spent the next hour pacing my room. I tried to control my breathing. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my neck. I checked my notes to see if I had any major gaps in my memory, but everything was scrambled. I could remember the basics of each conversation, but I kept wondering if I was missing details. I played back older recordings. Some had that strange, low voice in the background, and others had silence. Every time I heard it, I felt my head throb. I realized I needed proof of these figures or voices that others would believe. So I got my camera and decided to record during the next blackout. Around midnight, I heard distant thunder, and the lights flickered again. I turned on my camera and set it to night vision. I waited in the darkness of my room with the camera rolling. My chest felt tight. I heard the lodge creak around me. Then the power died completely. The blackness felt thicker than usual, like it had weight. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I heard static from the camera's microphone. I held my breath. A cold breeze touched my arm, but the window was closed. My ears picked up a faint whisper. It sounded like my own voice calling my name. I couldn't see anything, but I felt movement. My left shoulder twitched when something brushed against it. Then the camera shut off by itself, and I cursed under my breath. My skin tingled as I fumbled to turn it back on, but it wouldn't respond. All I had was the complete darkness and the sense that I wasn't alone. After what felt like minutes, the power came back. My camera was on the floor near my foot. I didn't remember dropping it. I picked it up and noticed the lens was cracked. My heart sank. I pressed the playback button, hoping it recorded something. There were only a few seconds of video before it cut to static. In that short clip, I saw my room bathed in the dim green glow of night vision. Behind me, near the door, there was a tall shape. It looked like a person, but I couldn't see any facial features. Then the clip ended. I tried not to panic, but my hands were shaking, and I felt lightheaded. I crashed onto the bed, feeling drained. My head spun with questions. I didn't know if I was hallucinating or if something truly existed in the dark. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, sweating, checking the corners of the room for signs of movement. My nightmares got worse. I saw myself standing in an endless hallway, hearing my voice echo around me, telling me to forget everything. In the morning, I found fresh scratches on my door, right near the handle. They weren't deep, but I hadn't seen them the day before. I ran my fingers over them and felt a dull ache in my chest. I remembered the words of that older man in the cafe, something about hearing voices that weren't his own, then losing bits of his memory. I felt a wave of nausea. Maybe these figures absorb memories or something along those lines. Maybe that's why we can't recall what happens when the lights go out. I noted that down, but I kept it simple. I reminded myself not to slip into guesses. I needed facts. That day, I decided to gather as many eyewitness accounts as possible. I went door to door, politely asking people if they had experienced anything strange during the blackouts. Most refused to talk. A few admitted to seeing shapes. One person said they sometimes felt a presence behind them, and when the lights returned, they found themselves in a different part of the house. Another mentioned hearing a recording of a voice that sounded like their own, but slowed down. No one could explain it, and they all seemed scared to dwell on it. By late afternoon, I returned to the lodge, exhausted. I planned to organize my notes, but my head felt cloudy. I realized I was losing chunks of time. I double-checked my watch. 40 minutes had passed since I came inside, but I didn't remember doing anything in that period. I looked around and noticed my bed was pulled away from the wall. My coat was on the floor, and the closet door was open. I had no clue why. The lodge manager knocked on my door around then. She asked if everything was okay because she heard noises. I said I was fine, but my voice was unconvincing. She looked at me with concern. I didn't mention the blackouts or the shapes. I just needed a moment to clear my head. That evening, another blackout hit. This time I decided to walk around outside. I turned on my flashlight and headed to the main street. The darkness was intense. The old street lamps were out. I felt my heart pounding. I could see a few other flashlights in the distance moving like fireflies. I walked slowly, listening for any unusual sounds. After a few steps, I heard static from somewhere nearby, like a radio. It crackled, then stopped. I pivoted, shining my light in every direction, but saw nothing. Then I felt a cold gust behind me. My flashlight flickered, and I saw a shadow along the wall to my right. It wasn't mine. It moved independently, sliding across the brick as if it had a mind of its own. My mouth went dry and my shoulders tensed up. I lifted the flashlight toward it, but it disappeared. I took a few steps back, almost tripping on uneven pavement. That's when I heard a whisper that sounded exactly like my voice. It said my name, stretching the syllables in a slow, distorted way. I couldn't breathe properly. My skin felt clammy. I tried to speak, but only a croak came out. Then I heard the whisper again. It said, "You won't remember." Suddenly the lights returned. The abrupt glare from the street lamp above made me blink. My ears rang. I looked around. No shadows. No voices. The air felt normal again, but my pulse was out of control. I checked my phone and saw I had missed a call, even though I didn't hear it ring. The call was from an unknown number with no voicemail. I stood there, unable to move for a while. I decided to leave. I rushed back to the lodge, packed my things, and turned in my key. The manager didn't try to stop me. She just gave me a sad look and said, "Drive safe." As I walked out, I saw the old street lamps flicker one more time. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel as I drove away. I kept checking the rearview mirror. The road was dark and I felt like there was someone in the back seat. But every time I looked, it was empty. I don't remember the exact route I took or how long the drive lasted. At one point, I pulled over and tried to piece together my thoughts. My phone's battery was almost dead, and I still had that strange static in my recordings. My voice kept overlapping with that other voice echoing in my head. I felt a headache building and my vision blurred for a second. Then it passed. I gripped the steering wheel, started the engine again, and forced myself to keep going. I can't say if there's a logical explanation for everything I experienced in that town. I just know I'm missing fragments of my time there. I'm certain I saw something in the darkness, and it had a voice that resembled mine. I've tried to forget those moments, but sometimes they come back in nightmares. I'll find myself thinking about that shape in the hallway, or that whisper in my ear. It feels like a part of me stayed behind in the blackouts, still stuck with those shadows, repeating words I can't fully remember. And I wonder if they'll show up again the next time the lights go out. I still remember the shock I felt the first time I saw that black space through the office window. I expected a normal city view, I had just walked into that old top-floor apartment, and I thought the thick curtain was there to block sunlight or maybe to keep the room cool. But when I drew it aside, I didn't see streets or buildings. All I saw was a dark void that didn't make any sense. I felt a tightness in my chest, and my hands started to tremble. I kept thinking I was tired, that maybe the angle of the window was weird, or that there was some trick of the light. None of it seemed logical, but I tried to push those doubts away because I needed a place to work. I needed a space for my blueprints and drafting table. That day I closed the curtain fast and decided I'd deal with it later. My name is Ethan. I'm an architect, and I've been doing freelance projects for a few years. I rented that old apartment because I wanted a quiet place with lots of natural light. The ad mentioned big windows, a good amount of space, and no direct neighbors on that floor. It sounded perfect for me, especially since I spend hours hunched over my drawing table. The rest of the apartment was typical. Creaky floors, chipped paint on the walls, a bit of mold in the corners. It had a small kitchen, a narrow living room, a cramped bedroom, and this bigger office that was supposed to be the main attraction. The landlord didn't say anything about the curtain or why it was there. He only mumbled something about the previous tenant liking dark rooms. When I first walked through the apartment, I felt a draft near that window. The air had a stale smell, almost like a damp basement. The rest of the place smelled like dust and old furniture, but that corner of the office smelled different. I pulled the curtain aside again after I dropped off my boxes. That dark space was still there, as if the building ended right at the glass. It wasn't nighttime. It was mid-afternoon. There was sunlight outside. I saw it through the other windows. But through that particular window, I saw nothing except an empty black surface that didn't reflect the room or me. I tried opening the window. The handle felt cold, like metal left in a freezer. It wouldn't budge at first. Then I felt something pulling back. It felt like there was a suction on the other side, but there was no rush of air. My stomach twisted, and I broke into a cold sweat. I tried again, yanking the handle harder, and that's when I felt a slight vibration, almost like the glass was pulsing. I let go, stepped back, and closed the curtain. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I told myself I'd call a contractor to check it, but deep down, I wasn't sure how to explain this problem. I unpacked my drafting table and set it in the opposite corner of the office. I set up my tools, my laptop, and my stack of reference books. I tried to work, but my focus drifted. My eyes kept darting to the heavy curtain, and I wondered if I should just seal that window permanently. But that felt extreme. I spent most of the evening measuring walls, trying to see if there was anything structurally off about that side of the apartment. The building plans I had were old. They showed a normal outer wall and a standard window facing the street. By all rights, I should have seen the skyline, other rooftops, or at least the top of a nearby building. That night, I sat in the living room trying to relax. The overhead light flickered on and off. The place had old wiring, so I wasn't surprised. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the office. It sounded like footsteps, but the floor creaks were out of rhythm, like somebody was walking with a limp. My heart started pounding again. I rose from the couch and moved slowly toward the office door. The tapping stopped for a few seconds, then picked up again. When I opened the door, the office was dark, except for a few lights from outside shining in through the normal windows. The big window with the curtain was black. I couldn't see its outline, but I felt a cold draft as soon as I stepped inside. I switched on the desk lamp and moved closer to the curtain. My breath caught in my throat when I saw faint lights shifting behind the fabric. They weren't reflections of car headlights or anything else I'd seen in a normal city view. They were small flickers, almost like flashlight beams dancing in a tunnel. I reached out to touch the curtain and I felt a slight static. It was enough to make my hair stand on end. I pulled my hand away and stared at the cloth. I could hear a soft scraping sound on the other side, like nails on a rough surface. I decided not to open it. Instead, I left the desk lamp on, shut the office door, and tried to get some sleep. Over the next few days, I kept working on my architectural projects. I had a renovation plan for a small house in the suburbs, and I needed to finish drafting the new floor layout. I tried to keep a normal routine. I'd wake up, make coffee, and spend hours at the table. checking measurements and angles. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting to the blackness beyond that curtain. I could feel this tension in my shoulders. I'd catch myself glancing in that direction, as if expecting the curtain to move on its own. One afternoon, while I was drawing a window detail for the renovation project, I heard a hiss of air from behind me. I froze. It sounded like someone slowly letting out a breath. I turned around, and the curtain was moving slightly, like a light breeze was pushing it. But all the other windows were closed. The door was shut. There wasn't any draft that I could detect. My throat felt dry. I stood up, walked over, and placed my palm against the curtain. The fabric rippled against my hand, and I felt a cold tingle shoot up my arm. I didn't open it. I just stood there, breathing in short, shaky gulps of air, trying to figure out what was happening. Eventually, I backed away and left the room. That evening, I decided to test something. I placed a small folding chair in front of the office window. I pulled the curtain aside about an inch, just enough for me to see through the glass. The darkness beyond was still absolute, like looking into a bottomless pit. The city was out there somewhere, but not through this window. I turned off all the lights except for a small desk lamp, and I sat there, watching. After a few minutes, I saw tiny sparks like fireflies flickering in that black space. They danced in random patterns, sometimes rushing forward, sometimes drifting away. My mouth went dry. I tried to keep calm, telling myself there had to be some explanation, maybe a reflection from somewhere else. Then I noticed something else. The glass wasn't reflecting me at all at first, but after a while I thought I saw a faint shape. I leaned forward. It looked like my outline, but it was off. The shoulders were a bit broader, and the head tilted in a different angle than mine. My chest got tight, and I felt goosebumps rising on my arms. I leaned closer, trying to see if it followed my movements. Suddenly, the shape moved on its own. It turned its head slightly to one side, as though it was looking right at me. I jumped back, my pulse thudding in my ears. I pulled the curtain shut and stepped away from the window. My hands shook. I felt a wave of nausea. I left the office and shut the door. Over the next week, I tried to ignore the window. I forced myself to focus on my projects and keep a normal schedule. But every time I walked into that office, I felt dread. The air felt colder there, even on hot days. Sometimes I heard faint knocks on the window, but they didn't match the sound of wind or rain. Sometimes I saw the curtain moving slightly, like someone was brushing past it on the other side. I started sleeping with the office door closed. I kept the rest of the apartment well lit, but I noticed the hallway lights flickering every night around the same time, usually just after midnight. I also noticed how the apartment felt bigger sometimes. One night, I swear the hallway seemed longer when I walked from the bedroom to the living room. The floorboards creaked in a pattern I'd never heard before. It felt like I was walking into a place that wasn't my apartment anymore. My heart pounded, and I kept telling myself it was my imagination. My curiosity finally took over. I decided to open that window and see what would happen, no matter how unsettling it felt. One afternoon, I cleared my schedule, made sure I had enough light in the room, and positioned my drafting table against the far wall. I wanted plenty of space in front of the window. I approached the curtain slowly. My palms were sweaty, and my heart thumped. When I grabbed the handle to pull the curtain aside, I felt a faint vibration again. I tried to steady my breathing. This time, I yanked the curtain all the way open. The window was larger than I'd realized. The frame was wide, with peeling paint along the edges. Behind the glass, the darkness looked infinite. I braced myself and grabbed the window handle. It felt like ice in my hand. I pulled up to unlock it. The latch clicked, and I felt a tug, like a vacuum, but there was no wind. My teeth clenched. The window cracked open about 2 inches. A cold air rushed in, and it smelled stale, like damp concrete. My eyes watered. I tried to push the window open further, but something was resisting. It felt like a person pulling from the other side. I leaned my body weight into it, but it only budged another inch or two. As I struggled, I looked into the blackness through the gap. I saw those flickering lights again swirling around in the distance. My stomach lurched when I realized there was nothing below the window frame. I couldn't see any part of the building's exterior or any sign of the street. There was just empty space. I felt a pulling sensation around my arms, like invisible hands grabbing me. I gasped, stumbled back, and let the window slam shut. My heart hammered as I locked it again. I stood there, panting, my shirt stuck to my back with sweat. My fingers tingled and my chest felt heavy. I pulled the curtain shut and sat on the floor for a long time, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't think straight. There was something behind that glass, something that wasn't part of the normal city view. It wanted me to open the window all the way. I didn't know why. The feeling of that pull made me lightheaded. I felt sure that if I'd forced it open, I would have fallen into that dark space. That night I heard footsteps in the hallway again, the same uneven, limping steps. I stayed in my bedroom and locked the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard a slow scraping sound. It made my teeth clench. It came from the office. It sounded like something dragging across the floor. I waited, my heart pounding. Eventually the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the ceiling, picturing that blackness beyond the window and the shape I had seen that looked like me. I wondered if it was still in there. In the morning, I found the office door wide open, even though I'd closed it before going to bed. The curtain was half drawn, revealing part of the dark glass. My drafting tools were scattered. A few pencils rolled to the floor. My coffee mug was knocked over, leaving a brown stain on the desk. My skin prickled when I saw it. I felt like something was playing with me. The floor felt cold under my bare feet, and the air smelled stale again. I walked toward the window. The curtain rustled, but there was no breeze. I looked at the glass, and I saw a reflection that looked like me. But the face was shifted. The expression was blank, and it blinked at a different time than I did. I swallowed hard. My lips felt chapped. I slowly raised my hand. The reflection raised its hand too, but there was a tiny delay. I moved my head to the side, and the reflection didn't match the exact tilt. My heart pounded. I backed away. I decided to keep the window locked and covered. I told myself I just needed to finish my current project and leave. I had 3 more weeks on the lease, but I couldn't imagine staying that long. My hands kept shaking whenever I walked into the office. Each day, I'd see new shifts in the reflection if I dared to peek. Sometimes the reflection didn't appear at all, and I'd just see that endless dark. Sometimes I'd see multiple reflections, each one slightly different, each one blinking or turning its head out of sync. During the evenings, the hallway lights flickered more often, and I'd catch faint whispers. It always sounded like they were coming from the office, but I could never make out words. It was more like a soft breeze carrying scattered sounds. My chest would tighten whenever I heard them. I tried playing loud music, but that only made the whispers stand out more in the silent gaps. The tension in my shoulders became constant. I lost track of my sleep schedule. My eyes stung from staring at my designs all day, but I refused to open that curtain again. The final week, the chills became worse. Even the living room felt cold, and the landlord said there was no issue with the heating. I could feel my heart race every time I heard the faint tapping sounds. Some nights I saw light creeping under the office door, an odd, trembling glow. I didn't check. I stayed in my bedroom with the door locked, trying to focus on my phone or my laptop, but every few minutes I'd stare at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. The day I decided to leave, I packed my stuff in a hurry. I took down my drafting table, threw my clothes in a bag, and made sure my laptop and files were all there. I kept glancing at the office door, which I had slammed shut. A few times, I heard muffled noises, like nails scratching on wood. I rushed through the rest of the packing, my hands shaking. I didn't care about leaving behind cleaning supplies or small items. I just wanted to get out. As I carried the last box toward the front door, I heard a thump behind me. I turned and saw the office door open about a foot. The heavy curtain was pulled back, revealing the blackness. The window seemed bigger than before, like it stretched farther across the wall. I felt a sudden chill and I froze. My reflection stood in the glass, wearing an expression that didn't feel like mine. It beckoned. a small movement of the hand. My legs felt weak. I forced myself to move. I turned around, opened the apartment door, and stepped into the hallway. My heart pounded and my skin felt clammy. I didn't look back. I shut the door, locked it, and left the key in the mailbox on my way out. I haven't been back to that building since. I found a new place to work, and I'm trying not to think about that window or the dark space behind it. But sometimes, late at night, I remember the lights flickering in that void, and the way my reflection had a life of its own. My mouth goes dry, and I feel my pulse racing. I don't know what was on the other side, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never forget the pull of that darkness, the staleness of the air, and the faint footsteps in the night. Even now, the memory makes my chest tighten. I just hope that whatever was there stays in that place, behind that window, in that black emptiness that shouldn't exist. I still remember the way my breath caught in my throat when I first walked through that front door. The owner stood behind me, jangling a set of heavy keys that echoed in the empty foyer. He didn't say much, just told me the basics of what I needed to do. Catalog the photos in every room, pick out the ones worth restoring, and see if I could do my usual magic. He said the house had belonged to some distant relative, and he was only here because it was part of an estate he'd inherited. He wanted to see if there was anything valuable left behind, especially old family photographs. That was where I came in. I'm Zachary. I restore photographs. I've been doing it for years. I've seen a lot of torn, burned, and scratched pictures. I've even handled some that smelled of mildew and others that came from attics where bats flew around. But this house was different. The walls had a strange silence. Every footstep sounded too loud. There was a stale odor, like dusty curtains and old wood. The place was big, with wide hallways and high ceilings, yet everything felt cramped because of the heavy drapes blocking most of the windows. Even when I tried opening them, half the time they got stuck and dust rained down in thick clouds. On my first day, I set up my temporary workstation in a room that might have been a dining room in the past. It had a long table in the middle and a single antique chair. I put my laptop and scanner on the table. The chair creaked under my weight, so I stood up again to test its legs just to be sure it wouldn't snap. It held. Then I started rummaging through the boxes the owner left for me. They were full of faded photos, some without frames, others stuck to the glass. Lots of the frames were chipped, with fine cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. A few had thick layers of dust inside, between the picture and the glass, which I found odd. Usually you don't see dust trapped inside like that unless the frame's been broken for a while. Late that afternoon, I walked down the corridor on the east side of the house. I wanted to get a sense of how many pictures were still hanging on the walls. Almost every inch was covered by old photographs in ornate frames. I saw formal family portraits with stiff poses, random snapshots of people standing in front of barns, and some pictures so blurry I couldn't tell what was going on. Each time I leaned in to look, I noticed small spots on the edges of the photos, like little smears that didn't match any normal aging pattern. They seemed shaped like shadows, maybe partial silhouettes, but I couldn't be sure. It was getting dark. I decided I'd do more detailed work in the morning, so I headed to the main foyer to grab my coat. On my way, I heard a dull crack somewhere behind me. It sounded like glass splitting. I stopped and turned around. The hallway was still. I glanced at the frames on the wall, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw a thin line spreading across the glass of one of the photos, right in front of my eyes, like it was forming on its own. A small crunching sound followed. I stepped closer and noticed the crack in the glass had formed a kind of swirling pattern. It gave me a strange feeling in my stomach. I let out a slow breath, then rubbed my eyes, thinking it might be the dim light. But the crack was still there. I didn't see anything else weird, so I left. My heart was thumping a bit faster than normal, though. The next morning, I woke up early and got back to the house by 9. The owner had left me a spare key, so I let myself in. The foyer smelled even mustier than before. I headed to the dining room to continue scanning. While I worked, I kept hearing small clicks and tinks, like the sound of cooling metal or glass under stress. Each time I paused to listen, it stopped. After a couple of hours, I decided I needed to stretch my legs and check the rest of the house. When I walked into the living room, I saw shattered glass on the rug. One of the frames lay face down, the backing splintered. I picked it up. The photograph inside was intact but had a thin, dark stain along the bottom edge. It reminded me of an ink spill, but it formed a shape almost like the bottom of a face. I squinted at it. It looked like a crooked jaw with a faint outline of teeth. I felt a chill rush through my arms. I put the frame down on a side table and took a closer look at the walls. Several other frames were slightly askew. I straightened them out, hoping that was the end of it. I figured maybe the old nails were loose and the frame just fell, but something about the shape in that photo made me uneasy. I went back to the dining room, scanned a few more pictures, then opened one in my editing software. It was a black and white portrait of a man and a woman standing in front of a carriage. They both stared directly at the camera, unsmiling. As I zoomed in to check for scratches, I noticed a faint outline behind them. It looked like another face, but it was smudged and barely visible. I tried adjusting the contrast. The shape became clearer, almost like it had elongated features, but it wasn't a normal face. It had exaggerated contours around the eyes and mouth. My chest tightened. I clicked the undo button, went back to the original scan, and the shape was still there, but fainter. My hands started to sweat. I decided to step away from my station and get some air. Outside, the sun was bright, but the house sat in the shade of tall trees. The wind rustled the branches, and I felt a brief sense of relief. I considered calling the owner to ask about the photos, but I doubted he'd know anything. I forced myself to go back inside. This was my job, after all, and I had a reputation for tackling difficult restorations. I spent the afternoon organizing the stacks of pictures. Most were normal old photos. Families on porches, couples in stiff poses, a few random snapshots of farmland. But every so often I'd find one with a weird distortion, a blotch that looked almost alive. After a few hours, my head was pounding. I needed a break. I walked through the house again, exploring the rooms I hadn't visited yet. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, the walls were covered with smaller frames arranged in neat rows. The glass on many of them was cracked or fogged. As I walked by, I thought I saw a figure move in one of the photos. I stopped, pressed my face closer, and only saw an empty rocking chair in the picture. But something made me step back. I scanned the entire row of frames. They all showed mundane scenes, kitchens, fields, houses. Then I heard a squeak behind me. I turned around fast, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway was empty. I stood still for a few seconds, waiting. I heard nothing else. My stomach felt tight. Before leaving that bedroom, I noticed a tall mirror propped against the far wall. It was dusty, and its surface was partially chipped at the corners. As I wiped it off with my sleeve, I caught my reflection. My face looked pale, and my eyes looked a bit bloodshot. Behind me, I thought I saw a shape in the mirror, something dark near the door. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I felt goosebumps spread across my arms. I decided to call it a day. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My thoughts kept drifting back to those smudged shapes in the photographs. I wondered if they were just odd patterns caused by age or some chemical reaction. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a coincidence. But another part of me kept thinking about the cracks forming right in front of me, the frames dropping off the walls, and that face I thought I saw in the stain. The next morning, I headed back to the house with a thermos of coffee. I planned to power through the job, finish scanning, and leave as soon as possible. I went straight to the dining room and started on a new batch of photos. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak from old floorboards. By noon, my eyes were tired. I turned on a small desk lamp, hoping the extra light would help. That's when I noticed something moving in the reflection on my laptop screen. I froze, slowly looked over my shoulder, and saw nothing. My heartbeat thudded in my chest. I let out a shaky breath and rubbed the back of my neck. I told myself I was just on edge. I took a quick break and decided to check one of the older frames on a wall nearby. I lifted it off its hook. The photograph showed two women standing by a lake, their expressions blank. I turned the frame around to see if there was any handwriting or date. All I saw was a thin layer of dust. Then I heard a sharp crack. I glanced at the glass. A hairline fracture was spreading from the bottom left corner toward the center. I felt an urge to drop the frame, but I held on. The glass popped again, then stopped. I set it aside carefully, took a few steps back and looked at the wall. Another frame next to it seemed to have shifted. I stepped closer and saw a faint mark on the photo. It looked like a smudge shaped like an eye. It was near the background, behind the main subjects in the shot. My scalp prickled. As the afternoon wore on, I continued to scan the photos. Each time I placed one on the scanner, I held my breath, expecting to see one of those distorted shapes. Often, I did. The more I looked, the more I found these twisted outlines that reminded me of faces. Some were faint, like water stains. Others were clearer, like faint figures peeking around corners within the photo. My heart pounded each time I zoomed in. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard glass shattering from somewhere upstairs. It was loud and sudden. I jumped to my feet, nearly knocking over my chair. My chest felt tight again. I walked out to the staircase in the foyer. The place was silent. The noise had come from the second floor. I stared up at the landing, unsure if I should go. After a few seconds, I forced myself up the stairs. My legs felt heavy. At the top, I turned down the hallway and saw shards of glass glinting on the floor. A large framed photo lay face down. The frame was broken in half. I approached it slowly. My mouth felt dry. I bent down and lifted it. The photo inside was torn right through the middle. I placed the pieces on a nearby table. My eyes locked on the tear. It cut across someone's face in the picture. There was a blackish smear along the tear that seemed fresh, like wet ink, but it didn't rub off on my fingers. I felt a jolt in my gut. I stood up, looked around, and noticed the other frames along the hallway were tilted. Some had fresh cracks in the glass. I listened for footsteps or any sign that someone else was in the house. Nothing. Just the ticking of an old clock somewhere downstairs. I didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. I realized I already had enough scans. I'd taken high-resolution images of the photos that mattered most for the restoration. I decided I would finalize my notes and tell the owner I was done. As I walked back to the dining room, I saw motion in the corner of my eye, a reflection in the broken shards on the floor. I paused and looked down. In the reflection, I saw my own face, but it was warped. My eyes looked sunken, my jaw was twisted. It looked like the same shape I'd seen in those photos. My stomach lurched. I staggered back, my heel scraping against the wood. When I glanced again, it was gone. The glass just showed my normal reflection, though it was cracked and distorted by the shards. I gathered my equipment in a hurry. My hands were shaking as I unplugged the scanner. I knocked over my thermos by accident and coffee spilled all over the table. I didn't bother to clean it up. I shoved my gear into my backpack and hurried toward the front door. While I locked up, I glanced at the dusty windows along the foyer. The frames on the walls were full of splintered glass, each photograph showing some kind of scar, either a physical crack or a blurred shape. I stepped outside into the damp afternoon air, feeling tension drain from my shoulders. I locked the door, tested the handle once, and walked straight to my car. I threw my bag in the passenger seat and started the engine. My hands were slick with sweat. I checked the rearview mirror, worried about what I might see in my own reflection. It was just me, looking shaken and exhausted. I sat there for a minute, telling myself I was done with that place. No one died in that house, and I didn't see any evidence of actual crimes. But I felt sure there was something I couldn't explain. I didn't care about finding the exact reason. My skin tingled with that lingering dread, and I just wanted to leave it behind. My heart was still pounding as I pulled onto the rural road and drove off. I promised myself I'd never set foot in that house again. Later that night, I opened my laptop to check the files. I needed to see what I had captured in the scans. But I hesitated. I was afraid I'd see something moving in those images, something that might look back at me. I ended up staring at the folder for a solid minute before finally clicking it open. I can't say I felt relief or closure, because every time I looked at a photo, I noticed something I couldn't explain. Small distortions, dark smudges shaped like twisted faces, faint outlines of eyes and mouths that didn't belong in any normal family picture. I eventually closed my laptop and pushed it aside. I knew I'd send the final files to the owner and be done. If he wanted more from me, I'd tell him I'd finished my part. I wouldn't go back. Even now, I sometimes think I hear the sound of glass cracking behind me, even when I'm in my own home, far from that place. I turn around and there's nothing there. But the memory of that house, with its endless halls of broken frames and those unsettling faces peering through the photographs, stays in my mind. And that's all there is to say about it. I went in, did my job, and got out. I'm done. I'm not going back.